He was Manhattan's most powerful billionaire. She was a quiet waitress nobody looked at twice. The night he pointed at her in front of a full restaurant and said, "You're fired," he thought he was ending her story. He had no idea she was the one holding the knife to his entire empire. What happens when a man with everything uses his money like a weapon and discovers the woman he tried to destroy owns every bank he borrowed from? Drop your city in the comments right now. Let's see how far this story travels. Like, follow, and don't move, because this one will change the way you see power forever. The rain came in sideways that Thursday evening, the kind that Manhattan gets in mid-November when the sky just gives up being polite about it. It hammered the glass faces of skyscrapers on Fifth Avenue, turned the gutters into small rivers, and drove most sensible people indoors before 6 o'clock. Ethan Vaughn was not most sensible people. He stood in the back of a black Escalade idling outside Billionaire's restaurant on West 57th, his phone pressed to his ear, his jaw working like he was chewing on something that tasted bad. He was 32 years old, wore a charcoal Brioni suit that cost more than most people's monthly rent, and had the kind of face that magazine photographers described as commanding, which was a polite way of saying that when Ethan looked at you, you automatically assumed you'd done something wrong. "Tell Nakamura the floor plan doesn't move," he said into the phone, low and flat. "I don't care what the structural team recommended. The atrium stays exactly where I designed it. You move it, and the whole sightline from the lobby dies. That's a $160 million decision, Marcus. I'm not making it for someone's convenience." A pause. He listened. His eyes drifted to the lit windows of Bellrose through the rain-streaked glass, watching shapes move inside. Waitstaff, candlelight, the blur of expensive dining. "Then tell them to be convenient on their own time," he said, and ended the call. His driver, a quiet man named Gerald who had worked for him for 4 years and learned not to ask questions, glanced in the rearview mirror. "We're at Bellrose, sir. Your guests arrived about 8 minutes ago." "I know." Ethan pocketed his phone and straightened his tie in the window reflection. He looked tired. Not the kind of tired that sleep fixes, but the other kind. The kind that settles into a person's face over years and becomes part of their expression. He was 32 years old, and he looked like a man carrying something heavy that he'd forgotten how to put down. "You need the umbrella?" "No." He got out in the rain anyway, walked the 12 steps to the entrance of Bellrose with water spotting his jacket, and didn't look back. Inside, the restaurant was exactly the kind of place where people came to be seen. Not famous necessarily, but significant. The specific class of Manhattan wealth that doesn't need to announce itself because every choice in the room does it for them. Dark walnut paneling, warm amber lighting, a pianist in the corner working through something quiet and classical that nobody was really listening to, but everyone was glad was there. White tablecloths with a single orchid at each setting. The kind of place where you could spend $800 on dinner and feel like you'd gotten value. The maitre d', a tall Frenchman named Olivier who had worked at Bellrose for 11 years, saw Ethan the moment he came through the door and moved immediately to intercept him. This was standard procedure. Ethan Vaughn was the kind of guest that a maitre d' reorganized half the floor for. "Mr. Vaughn, welcome back. Your party is at table 7. Mr. Nakamura and his associates arrived at—" "I know when they arrived. Is the Barolo I requested on the table?" "It will be poured the moment you're seated, sir." "It should already be breathing." "Of course. I apologize. It's fine." Ethan was already moving past him toward the back of the room, and he hadn't removed his wet jacket yet, and there was something in the set of his shoulders that made the 3 busboys near the service station instinctively find something to look busy with. Table 7 was in the prime position, centered, visible, from most of the room, far enough from the kitchen that conversation wasn't broken by sound, close enough to the pianist that the music carried without dominating. 4 men were already seated there. Hiroshi Nakamura, 61, the lead representative of a Japanese development consortium that Ethan had spent 8 months courting for a partnership on what would become the Vaughn Tower East project, a 47-story mixed-use development on the east side that was going to cost somewhere north of $900 million to complete and had already consumed 2 years of his life. Nakamura was conservative, meticulous, and deeply suspicious of American business culture's tendency toward excess. The other 3 men, Nakamura's legal counsel, his financial director, and a younger man whose precise role Ethan had never been able to clarify, were quiet by default and watched everything. This dinner was not a celebration. It was a negotiation wearing a dinner jacket. Ethan sat down, shook hands with the appropriate warmth, and immediately began the kind of controlled social performance that was second nature to him by now. Complimenting Nakamura's recent speech at an urban development summit in Osaka, asking thoughtful questions about the consortium's philosophy on sustainable design, making small, precise jokes that landed without being forced. He was very good at this. He had learned early that power had two faces, the one that crushed and the one that charmed, and that the second one was more effective, more durable, and more dangerous. The wine came. The conversation moved. Ethan watched the room without appearing to watch it, the way people do when they've spent years being aware of who's in every room they enter. That was when he first noticed her. She was moving between tables near the window. A waitress, slight, maybe 5'4", dark hair pulled back simply, in the standard Belarus uniform of black shirt and black apron. She wasn't doing anything remarkable. She was just working. Taking an order at a two-top near the window with her notepad, nodding slightly, and then moving to the next table with her eyes mostly down. She didn't look up much. That was the thing he noticed first. Most of the staff at a place like Belarus had a certain practiced attentiveness, always scanning, always presenting, always working the room with their eyes the way the maitre d' worked it with his feet. This woman kept her gaze at roughly table level, polite and contained, as if she were trying to occupy as little space in the room as possible. Ethan looked away. The conversation at his table had moved to the specifics of the East Side Project's financing timeline, and that required his full attention. He forgot about the waitress entirely. For about 20 minutes. Her name was Lily Harper, and she had worked at Belarus for 2 years, 3 months, and approximately 11 days, though she wasn't counting. She was 30 years old. She had a studio apartment on the Upper West Side with a leaky bathroom faucet she'd been meaning to call the super about for 6 weeks, and a collection of secondhand paperbacks stacked against the wall because she'd run out of bookshelf space. She drank her coffee black, not because she liked it that way particularly, but because adding milk required a decision in the morning that she wasn't always equipped to make before 7 a.m. She was, by any external measure, unremarkable. She liked it that way. There was a version of Lily Harper's life that most people, even the people who thought they knew her well, had no access to. That version included a trust fund, a seat on the board of a financial institution that managed somewhere in the vicinity of $40 billion in assets, and a surname that appeared in bronze letters on a building on Park Avenue. That version of Lily Harper had grown up attending board meetings with her father, studying international finance at Wharton, and quietly learning the architecture of wealth from the inside out. But that version also included a mother who died of cancer when Lily was 19, a father who collapsed from a stroke at 64 and handed her the majority shareholding of Harper Continental Bank while she was still figuring out who she was, and a world of inherited power she hadn't asked for and wasn't sure she wanted. So she'd made a decision 3 years ago. She'd walked away from the Park Avenue office, turned the day-to-day management of the bank over to a carefully selected board under her oversight, and found herself a job waitressing. Not because she needed the money, because she needed to be somewhere that required her to be useful with her hands, to carry things, to move, to be in a room where she was simply a person doing a job, and not a name that made other people rearrange their faces when they heard it. It was, she understood, unusual. Most people would consider it eccentric at minimum, possibly unhinged. Her friend Maya, who was one of 2 people who knew both versions of Lily's life, had said, "You have $40 billion under your signature and you want to carry plates for tips?" Lily had said, "It's not about the tips." Maya had said, "I know, that's what worries me." But it helped. It genuinely helped. There was something clarifying about working a Friday night dinner service at a packed restaurant, navigating tables and timing and the 1,000 small crises of an evening in a busy kitchen that the paneled boardrooms and investment reports didn't give her. It made her feel, in a way she couldn't entirely articulate, like a person with a body, present, specific, here. She had her rules. She dressed simply. She kept her eyes down. She didn't talk about herself beyond the minimum required. She was polite to the guests, thorough in her work, and left promptly after her shift. She had been managing this balance for over 2 years without incident, And then it was a rainy Thursday in November, and Ethan Vaughn sat down at table 7. She knew who he was the moment Olivier brought her the table allocation, and she saw the name. Most people in Manhattan finance would have known that name. Vaughn Development. The skyscraper that went up on the west side 2 years ago that changed the skyline enough that cab drivers started using it as a landmark. The man who bought the old Warwick Hotel property in a leveraged deal that the financial press had called either genius or reckless, depending on who you asked, for a full 6 weeks before the numbers proved it out. She'd seen his file, more than once. Harper Continental Bank was one of 3 primary lenders on Vaughn's current flagship project, the East Side Tower. The loan package had been arranged before Lily returned to active oversight, approved by the board under standard terms for a borrower of Ethan Vaughn's profile. It was a substantial arrangement. Multiple interconnected loan agreements, cross-collateralization provisions, covenant structures that were standard but meaningful. She kept her eyes down and gave his table to a colleague named Jordan, who was better at the high-profile guests anyway, and who enjoyed them in the way Lily didn't. She worked her section. She was polite. She was efficient. She didn't look at table 7 more than she needed to. She was clearing a dessert plate from the two-top near the window when she heard the crash. The sound was distinctive even over the ambient noise of the restaurant. Not a shattering, just a sharp clatter. And then the specific silence that follows when something unexpected happens in a public place. Conversation didn't stop exactly, but it stuttered and heads turned by reflex. A busboy named Danny Park had been crossing behind table 7, carrying a water pitcher to refill the glasses at the adjacent table. Danny was 17, had been working at Bellerose for 3 weeks, and was the primary earner in a household of 4 because his father had been injured on a construction site in September, and hadn't been back to work since. He was small for his age, conscientious to the point of anxiety, and had spent 3 weeks being terrified of making a mistake in a restaurant where mistakes had consequences. He'd caught the corner of a chair. It happened fast. The kind of small, stupid accident that is almost entirely a product of geometry and bad luck rather than carelessness. The pitcher tilted. Cold water came down across the right shoulder and sleeve of Ethan Vaughn's charcoal Brioni jacket, soaking into the fabric and spreading fast. The silence at table 7 lasted approximately 1 second. Then, "What the—" Ethan Vaughn pushed his chair back and stood up in the same motion, and even though his voice didn't rise above a certain controlled pitch, the temperature at that end of the restaurant dropped several degrees immediately. He was looking at Danny, who had gone completely white. I'm so sorry, sir. I'm so sorry. I didn't— Do you understand?" Ethan stopped. He looked down at his jacket. He looked at the table, where the water was spreading across the white cloth toward Nakamura's end. He looked at Nakamura, who was still and watching with the careful expression of a man who is absorbing information without reacting to it. The kind of expression that, in a business context, is significantly worse than visible displeasure. That was the thing. It wasn't just the jacket, though the jacket was ruined for the evening. It was Nakamura's face. It was the fact that this was a $900 million relationship that Ethan had been constructing for 8 months, and it was now paused while a 17-year-old busboy stood there shaking, and the table was soaked and the maitre d' was hurrying over and the whole room was watching. "Get the manager," Ethan said. Olivier was already there. "Mr. Vaughn, I am so deeply— I want him fired." Ethan kept his voice even. Matter of fact, as if he were requesting a clean napkin. "Tonight. I want him out before I sit back down." Danny made a small sound. He was still holding the empty pitcher, his hands white-knuckled around the handle. The room had gone genuinely quiet now. The pianist, who was either oblivious or had excellent timing, was between pieces. Olivier looked from Ethan to Danny and back to Ethan with the expression of a man who is doing very fast and unpleasant calculations. He was a decent man, Olivier. He didn't want to fire Danny. Danny was a good kid. But Ethan Vaughn was a guest who spent $800 here before wine, had brought in 3 high-profile business dinners in the past 6 months, and was the kind of man who had relationships with the restaurant's ownership. "Of course, Mr. Vaughn. If you'll allow me one moment to—" "Whom?" "No, now." It was the now that moved Lily. She had been standing 2 tables away, and she had watched the whole thing, and she had stood there for 30 seconds doing what she always did in situations like this, which was nothing, which was keeping her eyes down and her body small and her mouth shut, because that was the arrangement she'd made with herself about this version of her life. But Danny was 17 years old, and his hands were shaking, and his father was hurt, and he'd bumped a chair because the restaurant was busy and the aisle was narrow, and this man in a wet jacket was about to have him fired in front of a full room because his pride had been inconvenienced at a critical dinner. Lily set down the plate she was carrying. She stepped forward. "Excuse me." Her voice was quiet, not aggressive, not dramatic, just present and clear, and sufficiently certain that several people turned to look at where it had come from. Ethan turned. He looked at her. Looked at her, really, for the first time, though she'd been in the room the whole evening. A waitress. Unremarkable. Dark hair back. Eyes steady. "This is," Olivier started. "Yay." "He bumped a chair," Lily said. She was looking at Ethan. "It's a busy restaurant on a rainy night and the aisles get narrow when every table is full. He wasn't careless. It was an accident." A beat. "And you are?" Ethan asked. "I work here." A pause. "So does he. He's been here 3 weeks. He works hard. He shouldn't lose his job over an accident." Ethan's expression didn't shift. That was the unnerving thing. He didn't look angry exactly. He looked like someone who had just filed something away for later reference. "Are you seriously," he said, "defending this?" "Yes. You work here. You're a waitress." He said it without raising his voice, which somehow made it worse. "And you're standing in the middle of this restaurant, in front of my business associates, correcting me." Lily didn't answer that. There wasn't really anything to answer. "He soaked a jacket worth more than you make in 2 months," Ethan continued, still even. "He humiliated me in front of people I've spent 8 months building a relationship with. And your position is that there should be no consequence." "My position is that firing a teenager in front of the whole room because your jacket got wet isn't a consequence. It's a performance." The room was very quiet. Nakamura, across the table, had picked up his wine glass and was looking at it with focused attention. Ethan Vaughn looked at Lily for a long moment. She held his gaze without flinching, and that seemed to be the thing that really got to him. The not flinching. "What's your name?" he asked. "Lily. Lily." He nodded slowly. "I want you to understand something, Lily. I always follow through on what I say I'm going to do. Always." He looked around the room, let the silence breathe for a moment. "I'm going to buy this restaurant." A few guests shifted in their seats. Someone near the bar set down their glass. "And when I do," Ethan continued, looking back at her, his voice completely calm, "the first person I fire will be you." He sat back down. He straightened his ruined jacket. He looked across the table at Nakamura. "My apologies for the interruption," he said. "Where were we?" Nakamura looked up from his wine glass. "The financing timeline," he said. "Right." Ethan picked up his own glass. "So, the equity structure on the East Side project." The room gradually exhaled and returned to itself. Voices resuming, silverware resuming, the pianist beginning something new in the corner. Lily stood where she was for one more second. Then she picked up the plate she'd set down, turned, and walked back to the kitchen. Danny was standing near the service station, still clutching the empty pitcher. He was looking at her with an expression she didn't quite know what to do with. "You're okay," she said quietly, passing him. "He's not firing you tonight." She pushed through the kitchen door and didn't look back. She didn't sleep well that night. Not because she was scared. She examined that question honestly, somewhere around 2 in the morning when the rain was still going and she was lying in the dark of her apartment with the leaky faucet providing its irregular percussion in the background. Was she scared? No, not exactly. What she was, she decided, was something more complicated. She was unsettled. Not by Ethan Vaughn's threat. She understood more about what that threat actually meant than he did, which was a strange, tilted feeling, but by the fact that she'd stepped forward at all. That she'd broken her own rule. The rule was, stay small, stay quiet, stay out of things that aren't your business. A 17-year-old kid with a shaking hands and a hurt father wasn't your business, she told herself. But that was a lie, and she knew it. She turned over and stared at the ceiling. In the morning, she called her financial advisor, a precise and unflappable woman named Carla Chen, who had managed Lily's personal affairs and her oversight of Harper Continental for the past 4 years, and who had the ability to receive unexpected information without reacting visibly, which was a quality Lily valued extremely. "I need you to pull the full lending portfolio for Vaughn Development," Lily said. She was sitting at her kitchen table in a sweater, both hands around a mug of black coffee, watching rain from last night still dripping off the fire escape. "The East Side Tower primarily, and anything else we're holding." A brief pause. "Any particular reason?" "Pull the file. I want to read the covenant provisions on the primary loan agreement." Another pause. Shorter. Carla was already moving. "I'll have it to you this afternoon." "Thank you." She hung up and sat with her coffee. She wasn't planning anything yet. She was just reading. Alternate. She went into work the following evening the same as always. She wasn't sure what she expected. Some shifted atmosphere, maybe. Some residual charge from the night before. But Bellerose was just Bellerose. The bustle of setup. The smell of the kitchen already going at 4. Jordan complaining about a double booking. Olivier moving through the room with his hands clasped behind his back, doing his last checks before service. Danny was at the service station when she came in, folding napkins with the focused concentration of someone who is trying very hard to look like they aren't thinking about something. He looked up when she passed. "Hey," he said. "Hey. He paused, folded another napkin. "I just wanted to say, what you did last night, you didn't have to do that." "I know." He was serious. About buying this place. "I looked him up last night after my shift. He's like..." Danny shook his head slightly. "He actually does that kind of thing. He bought out a hotel once just because the owner publicly disagreed with him about a zoning decision. I read about it." Lily nodded. "I know who he is." Danny looked at her. "Are you scared?" She thought about that for a second. "No," she said. He seemed to want to say something else, but didn't. She moved past him toward the service area. "Lily," he said. She stopped. "Thank you," he said. "For real. My dad..." He stopped again, cleared his throat. "I really need this job." "I know," she said. "Keep folding." He turned back to his napkins. She tied on her apron and picked up her notepad. Service started at 5:30. The covenant provisions on the primary loan agreement arrived by secure email at 11:17 that night, after she'd gotten home from her shift. Carla had annotated them in her precise, slightly clinical way, with notes flagged in the margins. Lily read through the full 68 pages at the kitchen table with a glass of water, and the leaky faucet, and the kind of focused, unhurried attention that she'd learned from her father, who had been the kind of man who believed that reading financial documents too fast was how people got hurt. It took her about 90 minutes. When she was done, she sat back and looked at the window for a while. Rain again. Manhattan always had rain in November. The provisions were, as she'd half remembered from a brief overview she'd seen when she took back active oversight of the bank, fairly standard for a loan package of this scale. But standard didn't mean toothless. There were covenant restrictions on the use of loan proceeds, specifically a provision that prohibited using funds tied to the East Side Tower project for acquisitions unrelated to the project without written consent from the lending institution. There was a cross-default clause. There were performance benchmarks tied to the construction timeline. There were teeth if you were looking for them. She thought about Ethan Vaughn's face, the complete flat calm of it when he said, "I always follow through on what I say I'm going to do." Not anger exactly. Conviction. The bone-deep certainty of someone who had been right often enough that they'd stopped examining whether they might be wrong. She thought about Danny's hands shaking around the empty pitcher. She thought about the way the room had gone quiet. Not the comfortable quiet of a good restaurant, the other kind. She closed the file. She picked up her phone and called Carla. It was after midnight. Carla answered on the second ring because that was also a quality Lily valued. "Read the whole thing?" Carla asked. "Yes." "And?" Lily was quiet for a moment. "I'm not going to do anything yet," she said. "I just wanted to understand the full picture." "Okay." A pause. "Lily, this man threatened to buy the restaurant you work at specifically to fire you. I know what it is. That's not a hypothetical. He's done things like this before." "I know." So? So I wanted to read the file. Lily looked at the rain on the window. That's all for tonight. Carla was quiet for a moment. You're going to let him buy the restaurant? It wasn't a question. Lily didn't answer it. Get some sleep, she said. I'll call you tomorrow. She hung up. She put the annotated file in a folder on her desktop and labeled it with the date and nothing else. Then she went to bed. And this time, she slept fine. 3 days later, Ethan Vaughn's attorney contacted the ownership group of Bellerose Restaurant with a letter of intent to purchase. The owner of Bellerose was a 67-year-old man named George Ferraro, who had opened the restaurant 23 years ago and whose feelings about the place were somewhere in the vicinity of complicated love. He called Olivier that morning in a state of confusion and moderate distress. "Do you know who this is?" George said. "Vaughn. Vaughn Development. This man builds skyscrapers. Why does he want my restaurant?" Olivier, who had been at Bellerose the night of the incident and knew exactly why, considered his options carefully. "I'm not certain," he said. "His lawyers are offering $2.4 million over assessed value," George said. Over assessed value. For a restaurant. That doesn't happen. No, Olivier agreed. It doesn't. There was a long pause on the phone. George Ferraro was 67 years old and tired, and the restaurant had been costing him more than it made for the past 18 months, and his wife had been asking him quietly, with the patience of a woman who has been asking something quietly for a long time, whether they might spend some time in Boca before they were too old to enjoy it. "I'd be an idiot to turn it down," George said. Olivier was quiet. "Wouldn't I?" George said. "Mr. Ferraro," Olivier said carefully, "it might be worth understanding what his intentions are for the restaurant before deciding." "His intentions? He's buying it to fire a waitress, Olivier. I know what happened. You told me what happened." A pause. "Which is insane. It's insane. But it's also $2.4 million over asking, and I'm 67 years old." Olivier said nothing. "Tell the staff," George said finally. "They deserve to hear it from someone who isn't a lawyer." The news moved through Bellerose that afternoon. The way bad news moves through a workplace. Fast, patchwork, and with the specific flavor of dread that comes from uncertainty. People gathered in small clusters in the kitchen and at the service station, talking in low voices, checking their phones, checking each other's faces. Jordan found Lily near the end of the afternoon, before service. "Did you hear?" "Yes." Lily was restocking the service station, moving quietly and steadily. "He actually did it." Jordan shook his head. "He's actually buying this place. Because of you. Because you defended Danny." "Yes." Jordan looked at her. He'd worked alongside her for almost 2 years and had always had the sense that there was something underneath Lily's quietness that he couldn't quite identify. Not sadness, not damage, something more like contained depth, the feeling of standing at the edge of a lake and not being able to see the bottom. "Are you okay?" "I'm fine." "He's going to fire you." "I know." "Lily," Jordan lowered his voice, "are you actually fine? Because you look—" "I look like someone who is restocking silverware," she said. "Which is what I'm doing." She kept restocking. Jordan watched her for another second, then went back to his section. Danny found her a few minutes later. He looked sick. "This is my fault," he said immediately. "It's not. If I hadn't—" "Danny." She stopped what she was doing and looked at him. "What happened that night was not your fault. What's happening now is not your fault. Do you understand that?" He didn't look like he believed it. "Keep working," she said. "Don't make it something bigger than it is." But even as she said it, she could hear how that sounded, and she knew that for him it was something bigger. It was his job. It was his father. It was the specific grinding reality of needing a paycheck that meant the rent got paid and the grocery bag came home full. She went back to work. And in the kitchen, Marco, the head cook, was on the phone with his brother-in-law, who was a real estate lawyer, and Angie from the bar was sending her resume to 3 different restaurants, and Olivier was standing in the corner of his office staring at the wall with his hands still clasped behind his back like he was waiting for the restaurant to tell him what to do. The acquisition closed in 11 days. Ethan moved fast when he decided to move, and he had the resources to make paperwork move at a pace that inconvenienced other people's schedules rather than his own. His attorneys filed the closing documents on a Wednesday afternoon, and by the following Monday, Bellairo's restaurant had a new owner. He didn't think about it much in the interim. That was the honest answer, if he were giving honest answers, which was something he did with decreasing frequency. He had 9 other major things happening simultaneously. The East Side Tower was consuming enormous attention. He had a board presentation on Thursday that required prep, and his son Noah had a parent-teacher conference the next morning that he had already rescheduled twice and couldn't reschedule again without it becoming a different kind of conversation. Noah was 8 years old and had his mother's eyes, which was something Ethan had never entirely figured out how to be in the same room with. Not because he didn't love the boy, he loved him the way you love the one thing you'd burn everything else down to protect. But love, he'd discovered, wasn't the same thing as knowing how to be a person in front of your child. It wasn't the same as being present rather than just physically in the room. His housekeeper Maria had mentioned, carefully the previous week, that Noah had been asking whether his father was coming to his school's winter performance. "When is it?" Ethan had said. "December 14th. I'll check my calendar." Maria had looked at him with the expression she reserved for moments like this, which was no expression at all, which was somehow worse. He had not yet checked his calendar. This was the texture of his life: motion, pressure, forward momentum, and in the background, at a slight remove, the things that mattered most to him, always slightly out of focus because focusing on them required stopping, and he had not stopped in a very long time. He'd stopped, in a way, when his wife died. Sarah. 4 years ago now. A car accident on the Long Island Expressway on a Tuesday evening in March. And then she was gone. And the world kept moving in its insane, relentless way, and there was nothing to do but move with it because the alternative, the stopping, the really stopping, the actually sitting down with what had happened, was something he couldn't afford and so had never done. Work was motion. Motion was manageable. This was the system. It worked, more or less. It worked in the sense that the company kept growing and the towers kept going up and the name kept getting larger in the places where names like his got measured. What it didn't work at was the rest of it. But he was trying not to think about the rest of it. He signed the final documents for Bellairo's at his office on a Thursday morning, slid them across the desk to his attorney, and felt the specific, clean satisfaction of a completed intention. He had said he would do it. He had done it. That was the rule. He chose the following Friday night. The restaurant would be at full capacity. 130 covers, every table reserved, Friday dinner service in November. He understood stagecraft. You didn't make a point quietly in an empty room. You made it when everyone was watching. His assistant had called ahead to confirm the evening's reservations. He was booked at 8 o'clock, a table for 2, and to request that the full staff be present. A routine ownership review, his assistant had said. New management wanting to meet the team. He dressed with care that evening. A dark navy Keaton suit. No tie. Minimal but deliberate. He looked, Gerald thought, in the rearview mirror on the drive over, like a man going to something that wasn't a dinner. It was raining again. It seemed to Ethan vaguely like it was always raining in November. He didn't feel particularly good about what he was about to do. He examined that as the car moved through traffic and found it interesting. Not the not feeling good, but the fact that it didn't change anything. He'd made a promise. In front of investors and staff and a room full of strangers, he'd made a specific public promise. If he didn't follow through, what was that worth? What was any of it worth? If your word bent the first time following through made you feel slightly bad. He walked into Bellairo's at 8:06. The room was full. Candlelight, piano, white tablecloths. And there she was, moving between tables near the window with her notepad, eyes mostly down, exactly as she'd been 3 weeks ago. He crossed to the center of the room. "Excuse me," he said, loud enough to carry. The conversations around him began to slow and quiet. Olivier appeared at his elbow. "Mr. Vaughn, your table is—" "In a moment." Ethan looked around the room, making sure he was seen, making sure the moment registered. "My name is Ethan Vaughn. As of last Wednesday, I'm the new owner of this restaurant." He paused. "I want to make one staffing change tonight." He looked directly at Lily. She had stopped. She was holding a small tray with 2 water glasses on it, standing near the window table, watching him with an expression that was perfectly still. "You," he said, "you're fired." The room went quiet the same way it had 3 weeks ago. That same specific silence of a public space when something private suddenly happens inside it. Lily looked at him for a moment. Then she set the tray down carefully on the nearest empty table. She picked up the edge of her apron and untied the strings slowly, without rushing. She folded it in halves and then quarters and held it in both hands. She looked at it for a second. Then she looked up at him. And instead of walking toward the door, she walked toward him. The room watched. She stopped about 4 feet away, holding her folded apron, and when she spoke, her voice was quiet and entirely clear. "Mr. Vaughn," she said, "before I go, there's something you should know." He waited. "My name," she said, "is Lily Harper. My father was Robert Harper. I'm the majority shareholder and controlling interest of Harper Continental Bank." She paused. "Which currently holds your primary loan agreement for the Vaughan East project, along with 2 other significant facilities across your portfolio." A beat. "Buying this restaurant," she continued, "using funds tied to the East Side project loan, violated Section 14C of your loan agreement. That's the restricted use covenant. You didn't get written consent from the lender." Another pause. "You borrowed money with my signature on it and used it to fire me." The silence in the room had changed quality. It was no longer the silence of people watching a scene. It was the silence of people who weren't sure what they were watching anymore. Ethan Vaughn's face was difficult to read. The same controlled stillness as always, but something had shifted in the set of it, something small and fundamental, like a single load-bearing thing that had moved slightly out of alignment. "The bank," she said gently, as if she were explaining something to someone who wasn't feeling well, "has officially called in your loans, all of them. The notices went out this morning." She held his gaze. "I'm sorry," she said, and she sounded like she meant it, which was perhaps the strangest part of all. "I genuinely am, but you walked into this." And then, because there was nothing else to say, Lily Harper tucked her folded apron under her arm, turned, and walked out of the restaurant. Behind her, Ethan Vaughn stood in the center of Bellerose, surrounded by 130 silent diners, and for the first time in a very long time, he had absolutely no idea what to do next. The piano player had stopped. Outside, on West 57th, the rain came down without apology, soaking the sidewalk and the awnings and the shoes of people hurrying past, and Manhattan moved through the night the way it always did, indifferent and continuous, carrying everything forward whether you were ready or not. The notices went out at 9:17 that Friday morning, 7 hours before Ethan walked into Bellerose. Carla had handled it with the same efficiency she brought to everything. 3 separate certified letters dispatched by courier to Vaughn Development's registered legal address, the offices of Ethan's primary attorney, and the corporate headquarters on Park Avenue. Each letter was identical in its language, precise and formal and without excess. The bank was invoking its rights under Section 14C of the primary loan agreement. The restricted use covenant had been violated. All facilities under the Harper Continental lending portfolio for Vaughn Development were hereby called in full, effective immediately, with a 30-day window for remediation before enforcement proceedings would begin. 30 days was generous. Carla had said so. Standard practice for a violation of this category is 15 days, she'd told Lily the night before, sitting across from her at the kitchen table with the annotated file open between them and 2 untouched cups of tea going cold. 30 days is almost a courtesy. "I know," Lily had said. "You're giving him room to respond." "Yes." Carla had looked at her over the top of her reading glasses with the expression she reserved for moments when she believed Lily was being more patient than the situation warranted, but had decided not to say so directly. 30 days it is, then. The letters arrived at 9:17. By 11, Ethan's primary attorney, a sharp man named Richard Cole, who had worked with Ethan for 6 years and had the practiced steadiness of someone who had delivered bad news before, had called Ethan's cell phone 4 times. Ethan was in a site meeting at the East Side Tower, standing on an unfinished floor 40 stories up with a hard hat on, and the wind coming through the open framework in cold, determined gusts, and he'd sent all 4 calls to voicemail without looking at who was calling. He'd looked at his phone on the elevator ride back down. 4 missed calls from Cole. He'd called back while walking across the construction site toward his car, and Cole had answered on half a ring, which was the first sign that something was wrong, because Cole didn't pick up on half a ring unless he needed to talk immediately. "I need you in my office," Cole said. "Now, not this afternoon." "I have a board prep at 2. Cancel it?" A pause. "Ethan, Harper Continental called in your loans." The construction site noise continued around him. Machinery, shouting, the percussion of a city building itself. Ethan stopped walking. He stood on the concrete apron outside the site trailer, and the wind moved through his jacket, and he said, "Say that again?" Cole said it again. Ethan stood there for a moment, and then he said a word that he rarely said in professional contexts, and it came out flat and quiet rather than loud, which was somehow more expressive than if he'd shouted it. "All of them?" he said. "All of them. Eastside Primary, the Midtown refinancing facility, the construction bridge loan on the Harlem conversion project. Everything Harper Continental holds, all called in simultaneously." A beat. "This is the Waitress, isn't it?" Ethan didn't answer. "Ethan, I'll be at your office in 40 minutes, Ethan said. He hung up and stood in the wind for another 3 seconds, and then he walked to his car with the same measured stride he always used, and his face was unreadable, and Gerald, watching from the driver's seat, started the engine without being asked. The drive to Cole's office on Madison Avenue took 51 minutes in traffic. Ethan spent it looking out the window at the city, which was doing what it always did: moving, building, selling, absorbing, regenerating. His city. The skyline he'd added to. The infrastructure of wealth and ambition that he'd woven himself into so thoroughly that he sometimes had difficulty locating where it ended, and he began. He thought about the look on Lily Harper's face when she said, "I'm sorry." The specific quality of it. Not triumphant. Not cold. Just steady. The way someone looks when they've made a decision they knew was right and are carrying the weight of it without complaint. He hated that he'd noticed that. He hated more that it had surprised him. The meeting with Cole lasted 3 hours and was deeply unpleasant. Cole had a whiteboard. He used it. The numbers were drawn in columns with connecting lines showing the interdependencies. And when he was done, the whiteboard looked less like a financial overview and more like a diagram of something collapsing in slow motion. The East Side Tower alone required ongoing access to the Harper Continental facilities to maintain the construction bridge financing. Without that access, the project timeline collapsed within 60 days. Without the timeline, the investor agreements triggered their own performance clauses. Without the investors, the equity structure unwound. And that was before you factored in the Midtown and Harlem facilities, which had their own cascade effects. "It's surgical," Cole said, not without a certain professional admiration that he was trying to suppress. "Whoever structured this understood your portfolio better than most of your own board members do." "She runs the bank," Ethan said. He was sitting back in the chair across from Cole's desk with his jacket off and his sleeves rolled up, which was what he looked like when he was thinking hard. "She's been running it for 3 years. Then she knew exactly what she was holding before you walked into that restaurant the first time." "Yes." Cole sat down. He looked at Ethan with the directness of a man who had known him long enough to say things other people wouldn't say. "This started because you were going to fire a busboy." "I know what it started because..." "I'm not..." "I know, Richard." Silence. "Okay," Cole said. "So, options." He turned to the whiteboard and uncapped a different marker. "You have 30 days before enforcement. In that window, you can try to refinance the facilities through a different lender. You can attempt to negotiate with Harper Continental directly, or you can try to liquidate enough secondary assets to cover a portion of the called facilities and buy time. Who refinances this in 30 days? Cole was quiet. Who in this market, Ethan said, takes on $1 billion portfolio of called loans with 30 days on the clock and doesn't either lowball me into oblivion or run the other direction? Name me one institution. Cole didn't name one. Negotiating with Harper Continental means negotiating with her, Ethan said. Yes. She walked out of that restaurant tonight with her apron under her arm. She called in every loan I have simultaneously. She is not in a negotiating posture. Cole looked at the whiteboard. Liquidation then. Partial. What's partial? The Tribeca property. The Connecticut land holding. Possibly the Midtown office condo portfolio. There's a buyer who's been circling that for 18 months. We could close in. That's 40 million. Maybe 55 if Connecticut moves fast. Ethan shook his head. Against what we're looking at? That's a week of breathing room. Cole capped his marker and set it on the desk. He was quiet for a moment, and in the quiet, Ethan could hear the building sounds of Madison Avenue through the window. Traffic, horns, the specific compressed energy of the city in the early evening. Ethan, Cole said, I have to say this, and I need you to hear it as your lawyer and not as an opponent. The exposure here is significant. The time window is real. If we don't move in the next 72 hours on at least the liquidation strategy, the 30 days stops feeling like a courtesy and starts feeling like a trap. Ethan was looking at the window. Are you hearing me? I'm hearing you, Ethan said. Give me tonight. Cole looked at him. I need one night to think, Ethan said. I'll call you in the morning. He put his jacket back on, shook Cole's hand with the kind of grip that doesn't show what it's covering, and left. In the elevator down, he checked his phone. 17 messages. His CFO. 2 board members. His head of investor relations, 3 times. His publicist, twice, which meant it was already moving in the financial press, or about to be. His assistant Marcus, 6 times, each message increasingly compressed into shorter and shorter sentences that track the escalating urgency of someone who can see a problem getting bigger in real time and can't reach the person who needs to know about it. And one message, buried in the middle, from Maria. Noah asked if you're coming home for dinner. I said I wasn't sure. He said okay. Just so you know. Ethan stood in the lobby of Cole's building and looked at that message for a long moment. The lobby had marble floors and a doorman who was paying him no attention, and through the glass doors the city moved past in its relentless way. He called Marcus back first. What's out there? He said, walking toward the door. The Journal has a piece running online in about an hour, Marcus said. He sounded like he hadn't breathed properly since noon. They're framing it as, they're going with the angle that the loan call is in response to the restaurant acquisition. The full story, the busboy, the waitress, all of it. Who talked? I don't know yet. It could have been anyone in that restaurant Friday night. It could have been someone in the bank. Ethan, it's the kind of story that writes itself once someone pulls on one thread. Ethan pushed through the lobby doors into the November evening, cold. The city smelled like wet pavement and exhaust, and somewhere, distantly, someone's food cart. What's the headline? A pause. Vaughn's pride costs him his empire. Marcus cleared his throat. That's what they're going with. Ethan got into the back of the Escalade. Gerald pulled into traffic without a word. Manage the board, Ethan said. Tell them I'll be available for a call tomorrow morning at 8. Tell investor relations to hold all statements until I've spoken with Cole. And tell the publicist, he stopped. Tell the publicist I'll get back to them. Ethan, tomorrow, Marcus. He hung up and sat in the back of the car in the movement of Friday night Manhattan traffic and let himself, for approximately 90 seconds, feel the weight of what was happening. Not think about strategy, not plan, just feel it, the scale of it, the velocity of it, the specific terrible efficiency with which a single evening's decision, one impulsive, pride-driven, petty decision, had set this machine in motion. He'd walked into that restaurant 3 weeks ago because someone had spoken to him in front of his investors in a way that hadn't sat right with him. And he had done what he always did. He'd made it about power. He'd made it about winning. He'd used his resources like a weapon because the weapon was available and using it felt like control. And now the weapon had turned around. Gerald, he said. Sir? Take me home. Gerald drove. The city slid past the windows. Ethan looked at it without really seeing it, which was not something he did very often. He thought about Noah asking if he was coming home for dinner. He said, okay, just so you know. Something in the simplicity of that, the small, practiced resignation of an 8-year-old learning to modulate his expectations of his father, landed somewhere in Ethan's chest with a weight that the financial crisis, somehow, had not. He got home at 8:45. The townhouse on the Upper East Side was lit from the inside, warm against the dark street. Maria had left dinner in the oven. Noah was supposed to be in bed already. It was a school night. But when Ethan came through the front door and stood in the hallway shrugging off his jacket, he heard movement upstairs. Small feet. Then the top of the stairs. Noah appeared at the landing in his pajamas, dark-haired, large-eyed, with his mother's eyes in the specific way Ethan could never entirely prepare himself for. He was holding a book against his chest. "You're home," Noah said. "I'm home." Ethan looked up at him. "You're supposed to be asleep." "I know." A pause. "Maria said you might be late." "I was late. But you're home now." "Yeah." Ethan stood at the bottom of the stairs. He felt suddenly like someone who had been moving very fast for a very long time and had just stopped and discovered that stopping was actually quite difficult. His legs felt strange. The hallway felt very quiet. "I'm home." Noah came down 4 steps and sat on the 5th, the way he did sometimes when he wanted to talk, but wasn't sure how to start. He was quiet for a moment, picking at the spine of his book. "Are you okay?" Noah said. Ethan looked at his son. "Why do you ask?" Noah shrugged in the non-committal way of 8-year-olds everywhere. "You look like when you're worried, but you're not saying you're worried." Ethan climbed the stairs and sat down next to him on the 5th step, which was slightly too small for 2 people but manageable. He leaned back against the wall. The hallway light was soft. It smelled like whatever Maria had cooked, something with garlic. "I have some work problems," Ethan said. "Bad ones?" "Yeah, pretty bad ones." Noah absorbed this. He was quiet for a moment, which was something Ethan had noticed about him. He processed before he responded, which was something he had not gotten from his father. "Will you fix them?" "I don't know yet." Another pause. "Is it because of money?" Ethan looked at him sideways. "What makes you ask that?" "I heard Marcus on the phone when he came to drop something off yesterday. He was talking outside. He said—" Noah paused carefully. "He said something about loans." Ethan was quiet. "I don't really know what loans are," Noah said. "I mean, I know kind of. Like borrowing money." "Yeah, like borrowing money." "And you borrowed too much?" Ethan thought about how to answer that. He thought about the whiteboard in Cole's office, the cascading columns of debt and exposure and timeline. He thought about the 30-day window. He thought about the right answer to give an 8-year-old and the true answer, and whether those things could be the same. "I did something stupid," he said, "and it made the borrowing problem a lot worse than it needed to be." Noah looked at him with Sarah's eyes. "What stupid thing?" "I was angry at someone. And instead of just letting it go, I used my money to get back at them. And it turned out the person had a lot more power than I realized." Noah thought about this for a few seconds. "Like when I got mad at Tyler for telling everyone I was scared of the diving board, and I told everyone he still sleeps with a stuffed animal, and then it turned out Tyler told his mom and his mom called your phone." Ethan blinked. "Somewhat like that, yes." "That was bad," Noah said. "You were really annoyed at me." "I was." "You said I made it worse when I could have just walked away." Ethan didn't say anything to that. Noah was quiet for a moment. "So you did the same thing." Ethan sat on the step next to his 8-year-old son in the soft light of their hallway and did not have a single word to put in front of that. "Yeah," he said finally, "I did the same thing." Noah seemed to accept this with equanimity. "Are you going to say sorry to them?" "It's complicated." "Why?" "Because—" Ethan stopped. He genuinely did not have a clean answer to why. In his professional life, apology was a negotiating tool at best, a liability at worst. You apologized when it gave you something: leverage, sympathy, a path forward. You didn't apologize as an end in itself. That was not the grammar of the world he moved through. Because it's not that simple. Noah looked at him with the expression of someone who suspects an adult is about to explain why the simple thing is complicated when really they just don't want to do the simple thing. It was a startlingly perceptive expression for someone in dinosaur pajamas. "Okay," Noah said, in the tone that meant he didn't entirely believe this but was going to let it go because it was late. He stood up and climbed back up the stairs. "Night, Dad." "Good night." Ethan watched him go. "Noah." Noah stopped. "I'll try to make it to the December 14th thing, the school performance." A beat of silence. Then Noah, not turning around, "You don't have to promise if you're not sure." and then he disappeared down the hall, and his door closed gently, and Ethan sat on the step alone in the quiet for a while. The dinner Maria left was cold by the time he got to it, and he ate it at the kitchen counter standing up, looking at nothing, which was how he ate most meals when he was alone, which was most of the time. The Wall Street Journal piece ran at 9:48. He read it on his phone at the counter, still standing, fork in one hand. It was exactly as bad as Marcus had suggested, meticulously reported, tonally devastating in the way that financial journalism can be when the story writes itself. The reporter had found sources inside the restaurant. Sources inside the bank's legal department, probably, or at minimum someone who understood the covenant provisions. The headline was slightly different from what Marcus had said, how a billionaire's vendetta became his undoing, but the effect was the same. The comment section, which he read for approximately 45 seconds before stopping, was unanimous. He put his phone face down on the counter. He finished eating. He washed his plate because Maria had told him years ago that leaving dishes was inconsiderate, and it had somehow stuck despite everything else that hadn't. He went upstairs. He did not sleep well. At 3 a.m, he was sitting at the desk in his home office with the full Vaughn Development financial overview spread across 3 screens, the kind of comprehensive picture that his CFO usually managed and that Ethan had, in the past several years, increasingly allowed to exist at a comfortable remove. He had been moving fast and building fast and trusting that the architecture beneath him was sound, because it had always been sound before, because he had good people, because the numbers always worked out. The numbers were not working out. Cole had been right. The 30-day window was precise. Not cruel, but not generous. Lily Harper had given him exactly enough time to see the problem clearly and not quite enough time to solve it comfortably. The liquidation strategy was real but insufficient. The refinancing avenue was effectively closed in the timeline. And the investor relationships, the Nakamura Consortium specifically, which represented 60% of the equity commitment on the East Side Tower, were almost certainly being watched very carefully right now, which meant Thursday morning's board presentation was no longer a presentation. It was a triage. He sat at the desk until 5, when the first gray light began to come through the window over the street, and then he closed the screens and went to shower. And by 6:15, he was back in the car with his phone already going and Gerald driving him into the city, which was already moving the way it always was, which did not care at all about the problems of any specific person moving through it. It was Marcus who told him, at 6:58 in the morning, that the Nakamura Consortium had formally requested a postponement of the Thursday board presentation, citing concern regarding the recent developments in the lending structure of the project, which was the polished, careful language of people who were looking for the exit and hadn't yet decided whether they were going to use it. Ethan was in the back of the car when he heard this. He looked out at the city. "When did the request come in?" he said. "About an hour ago. Tokyo time. They were up all night, I think." "Of course they were." He closed his eyes briefly. "Move the presentation. Give them whatever date they want. Don't push." "And Ethan, the Bloomberg terminal has a piece going up at 8. It's quoting 2 unnamed sources from inside Vaughn Development, saying the company is exploring restructuring options. The word restructuring in financial context had a specific meaning that was distinct from its everyday usage. In everyday usage, it meant reorganization. In financial context, it meant something closer to triage, the kind of language that preceded harder words. "Who talked to Bloomberg?" Ethan said. "I don't know." "Find out." He paused. "Actually, don't. It doesn't matter." He rubbed his face with one hand. "Marcus?" "Yeah. Where are we on the Connecticut land holding? The potential buyer?" "I made contact last night. They're interested, but they want 2 weeks of due diligence before they commit to a price." 2 weeks? "Yeah." Ethan looked at the city sliding past the window. 2 weeks of due diligence. 30 days on the clock. A consortium asking for a postponement. Bloomberg calling it restructuring at 8 in the morning on a Saturday. "Okay," he said. "I want a meeting set up. Just me and Cole this afternoon. 2 o'clock. And call whoever runs investor communications at the Harper Continental Institutional Desk. Not the bank's legal team, their IR office." Marcus was quiet for a moment. Are you going to try to negotiate directly with the bank?" "I'm going to try to understand what their position actually is," Ethan said. "Those are different things." He hung up. He looked at the city. The skyline was pale and gray and lit from the east where the sun was coming up behind everything, giving the buildings that flat, indifferent morning light that stripped away all the drama they wore at night. He had built 3 of those buildings, added 3 shapes to that skyline. The fact that they were there, permanent and concrete and real, had been one of the few things in the past 4 years that he'd been able to look at without complication. Now they were looking back at him differently. The call to Harper Continental's investor relations office was routed, politely but promptly, to an assistant who said that Ms. Harper was unavailable, but that he was welcome to communicate through the bank's legal counsel. Ms. Harper. Not the head of the IR desk, not the managing director or the VP of institutional lending, Ms. Harper, personally. Which meant either Lily Harper was running this the same way she'd run everything else, personally, quietly, with her hands on every wire, or the IR desk was protecting her, or both. "Thank her for taking my call," Ethan told the assistant, which was technically inaccurate since she hadn't taken it, but the assistant understood the message. He called Cole. "Negotiating directly isn't going to work," Cole said, without pleasantries. "She's not in that posture. I told you that." "I know. I'm not negotiating. I'm assessing." Ethan was at his office now, standing at the window looking downtown. The view from here was one of his favorite things about this office. The grid of the city stretching south toward the water, the density of it, the accumulated ambition of 200 years of building on this island. She called everything in simultaneously. That's not a negotiating position. That's a demolition position. Yes. But she gave 30 days, which you said was a courtesy. Maybe. Or maybe there's something in the 30 days that matters to her beyond giving me time to respond. He was quiet for a moment. She didn't have to give me anything. She could have started enforcement proceedings immediately. The violation was clear-cut. 30 days wasn't required. Cole was quiet on the other end. "She's not trying to destroy me," Ethan said. "Or she is, but not carelessly. There's a reason for everything she's done, including that number." "Ethan," Cole said carefully, "I want you to hear what I'm about to say. Are you ready?" "Go ahead. You spent 3 weeks buying a restaurant specifically to humiliate this woman. You fired her in front of 130 people as a demonstration, and she responded by calling your loans. That is the complete factual record. If you now try to construct a narrative in which there's a message in her choice of 30 days rather than 15, that you need to decode, you are doing the same thing you always do, which is looking for the angle, looking for the leverage, looking for the way to turn the situation into something you can win. A beat. Maybe there isn't an angle. Maybe she gave you 30 days because she's a fair person and 30 days is fair. And maybe the thing to do is not to find the angle, but to deal with what's actually happening." The city spread out below the window. Ethan looked at it. "What's actually happening," he said, "is that my company is collapsing." "Yes," Cole said, "that's what's actually happening." Ethan was quiet for a long time, long enough that Cole said his name once to check he was still there. "I know," Ethan said. "I know. Set up the 2 o'clock, and Richard—" He stopped. "Get me the full current asset inventory, everything, not just the portfolio I look at. Everything, the townhouse, the vacation properties, the car collection, the art." He looked at the skyline. "I want to know what I actually have." Cole was quiet for a beat. "I'll have it by noon." Ethan hung up. He stood at the window for another minute, looking at the city that was doing what it always did, that did not slow down for any single person's crisis, that had swallowed larger disasters than this and moved on without marking the spot. He thought about Noah on the stairs, in his pajamas, with Sarah's eyes. So you did the same thing. He thought about Lily Harper walking out of Bellerose with her folded apron under her arm and that look on her face. Not satisfaction, not victory, just the contained gravity of someone carrying a decision they've already made and aren't going to put down. He had done this. That was the absolute truth of it, stripped of strategy and leverage and the instinct to find an angle. He had done this, piece by piece, on purpose, out of pride. The city moved below him. He turned from the window and went back to his desk. There was work to do, and it was the worst kind. Not the work of building, but the work of accounting for what you'd broken. He opened the first file and began to read. The asset inventory arrived at 11:53, 7 minutes before Cole had promised it. which told Ethan that Cole had started pulling it together before they'd even hung up. Had probably started the moment the loan notices went out Friday morning, because Cole was the kind of attorney who ran toward a fire while other people were still deciding if they smelled smoke. Ethan read through it at his desk with the door closed and his phone on silent. It took 40 minutes. He did not rush it. The picture it assembled was complicated. Not destroyed, not yet, but the word that kept presenting itself as he moved through the pages was exposed. He had always operated with significant leverage, because leverage was how you built fast in this market, because the window for a deal like the East Side Tower didn't stay open long enough to wait until you had the capital in hand. You borrowed against what you were building to build more. It was standard practice for developers at his level, and it had always worked because the buildings kept going up and the valuations kept climbing, and the revenue kept servicing the debt. What it required as a system was continuity. One thing funding the next thing funding the next. Remove a single load-bearing element and the whole sequence had to be renegotiated simultaneously, which was effectively impossible. The Harper Continental facilities were load-bearing. He had a list of liquid assets, real liquid, cash and near cash, that would have looked impressive to most people and looked terrifyingly thin to him in this context. The townhouse was worth something, but selling it meant moving Noah, and he wasn't ready to put that on the table yet, though he could see the shape of a future where it might not be a choice. The Connecticut property was in motion. The art collection and car portfolio together might get him to $30 million if the market was willing and the timeline wasn't punishing. What he did not have was the ability to simply cover what Harper Continental was calling in. Not liquid, not fast. He called Cole at 1:55 and was in his office by 2. Cole had brought in someone new, a restructuring specialist named Janet Foss, who worked out of a firm on Lexington and had a reputation for being surgically unsentimental about financial situations, which was a quality Ethan understood and respected even when it was uncomfortable. She was perhaps 55, compact, with close-cropped silver hair and the manner of someone who had sat in a lot of rooms like this one and found most of the panic in them unnecessary. She had her own copy of the inventory. "Let me be direct," she said, which in Ethan's experience were the 4 words that preceded the most useful information in any meeting. You have 2 real options in this window. 1, you find a bridge lender willing to take on the exposure at a rate that won't bury you. And I have to be honest with you, that market is not friendly right now for a borrower in a called loan situation with this much press attached to it. 2, you go back to Harper Continental. "She's not negotiating," Ethan said. "Everyone negotiates," Foss said, without inflection. "The question is what the other party actually wants. What does she want?" Ethan was quiet. "Because called loans," Foss continued, "generate a lot of work and a lot of legal cost and a certain amount of reputational friction for the institution holding them. They also don't always recover full value on enforcement. Real estate development assets in mid-construction are not liquid. So there's a cost to calling these loans that Harper Continental is absorbing too." She looked at him. "Which means she didn't do this because it was the most economically efficient move. She did it for a different reason. And if you don't understand the reason, you can't understand the position." Cole was watching Ethan. Ethan looked at his copy of the inventory without seeing it. He was thinking about a woman standing in a restaurant with a folded apron and a tone of voice that wasn't angry exactly. He was thinking about what Cole had said on the phone. Maybe the thing to do is not to find the angle. "She did it," Ethan said slowly. "Because a 17-year-old kid almost lost his job over nothing, and she decided that had a consequence." Foss looked at him without expression. "That's a personal motivation." "Yes." "In a business context." "Yes." A pause. "Then the question is whether the personal motivation has been satisfied or whether it's ongoing." She set down her pen. "Did you actually fire the boy?" "No." "Does she know that?" Ethan opened his mouth and then closed it. He genuinely didn't know. The restaurant had been purchased. He'd walked in and fired Lily, and then Lily had walked out and told him his loans were called, and the room had gone very quiet, and he hadn't. He hadn't thought about Danny since that moment in any concrete way. He'd been thinking about the loans, the exposure, the investors, the press, the 30-day window, not about a 17-year-old busboy. "I don't know," he said. Cole and Foss exchanged a brief look that Ethan caught, and that contained more information than either of them probably intended. I'll find out, Ethan said. The meeting ran another hour and produced a list of actions. The Connecticut buyer needed to be moved to a signed LOI within the week. Cole would initiate preliminary contact with 2 potential bridge lenders on a confidential basis. And Foss would prepare a restructuring memorandum that could be used in different ways depending on how the next 10 days moved. When Ethan left, the late afternoon sky over Madison Avenue was already going dark at the edges, which happened fast in November. The days giving up before you felt ready for them to. He sat in the back of the car and called Marcus. "Danny Park," he said, "the busboy from Bellerose. I need to know if he's still employed there." A pause that communicated several things Marcus didn't say. "I'll find out." "Tonight." "Yeah." Another pause. "Ethan, there's something else." "What?" Nakamura's office called again. Not the consortium's legal team. Nakamura personally. He wants a call with you directly, not through intermediaries. Ethan processed this. Nakamura calling personally was different from the consortium's formal postponement request. Nakamura calling personally meant the man was still in the conversation, still deciding, still, possibly, looking for a reason to stay rather than a reason to leave. You didn't call someone personally to tell them you were finished with them. You sent a letter for that. "Set it up," Ethan said. "Whatever time works for Tokyo." "It'll be late here." "I know, set it up." He hung up and looked out the window. The city was going into its evening mode, the lights coming on building by building as the sky darkened, the streets thickening with the particular energy of Friday evening becoming Saturday night. People moving toward whatever they were moving toward with the specific forward momentum of people who knew where they were going. He had never, in the past 4 years, not known where he was going. He found it profoundly disorienting. Marcus called back at 7:42. Danny Park was still employed at Bellerose. More than that, in the 48 hours since Ethan's purchase had formally gone through, the day-to-day management of the restaurant appeared to be operating through an external management company. The staff had received a communication, Marcus said. He'd gotten this through his contact who knew someone in the kitchen, saying that operations would continue normally under interim management while ownership matters were being finalized. No one had been let go. No one. Which meant Ethan had never actually followed through on the original threat either. He'd bought the restaurant, he'd gone there to fire Lily, and he'd fired Lily, and then he'd gone home. And the busboy he'd wanted fired in the first place was still there, still folding napkins or whatever he did, still employed. He sat with that information for a while. He wasn't sure what it told him about Lily Harper exactly, except that everything she did seemed to be pointed in the same direction, and the direction was not what he would have predicted. The call with Nakamura came through at 11:20 that night. Ethan was still at his desk. He'd stopped going home at a reasonable hour around day 3 of this, and the office had started to feel like the more honest location for the version of himself he currently was. He'd had food brought in. There was a cold cup of coffee on the corner of the desk that he kept meaning to throw away. Nakamura's voice on the phone was the same as it was in person, measured, considered, with the specific quality of someone who chose every word before releasing it. "Mr. Vaughn," he said, "thank you for speaking with me directly." "Of course, thank you for calling." A brief pause, the kind that in cross-cultural business communication carries its own information. "I want to be honest with you. My consortium is concerned." "I understand. The exposure is significant. The timeline is... It creates difficulty." Another pause. "But I'm also mindful that you and I have spent 8 months building something. That relationship has value that a balance sheet does not fully capture." Ethan was very still. He understood what Nakamura was doing, which was giving him a door that was still slightly open, and understood simultaneously that the way he walked through that door mattered enormously. "Mr. Nakamura," he said, "I owe you an apology. What happened at Bellerose 3 weeks ago, the incident with the staff member, that was a demonstration of the kind of judgment that should concern anyone in a business relationship with me. I made a decision out of wounded pride, and it cost both of us time and credibility that I had not earned the right to waste." He paused. "I'm telling you this not as a negotiating position. I'm telling you because it's true, and you deserve a straight account." Silence on the line. "The financial situation is real, and I'm managing it. Ethan continued. The exposure is what it is. I'm not going to pretend the 30-day window isn't the 30-day window, but I want you to know that the project itself, the design, the timeline as it stood before this week, the fundamentals of what we're building together, none of that has changed, and I intend to find a path through this. More silence. Then Nakamura said, How? I'm working on it, Ethan said. Honestly, I don't have a clean answer yet. Another pause, longer. I appreciate the honesty, Nakamura said. It is not always what I receive in these conversations. I know. I will speak with my consortium, Nakamura said. We will not make any decisions this week. That is what I can offer you. That's enough, thank you. Mr. Vaughn. A final pause. I hope you find your path through. The call ended. Ethan sat in the quiet office with the cold coffee and the dark windows and the city below, and he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time, which was the strange, uncomfortable sensation of having been more honest with someone than his instincts told him to be, and having it land better than the calculated version would have. He was not sure what to do with that. He went home at midnight. Noah was asleep. The house was quiet. He stood in the doorway of Noah's room for a moment, not going in, just standing there in the dark, looking at the shape of his kid asleep in the bed with one arm thrown over the edge, and his sneakers in the middle of the floor where he'd left them, and a half-finished glass of water on the nightstand. He went to bed. He slept 3 hours, approximately. In the morning, he made breakfast, which he almost never did, and Noah came downstairs at 7:15 to find eggs and toast and his father standing at the kitchen counter, looking slightly wrecked but present. Noah looked at the eggs and then at his father. You're here, he said. I'm here. It's Sunday. I know what day it is. Noah sat down at the table. He ate half the eggs before saying anything else. Then, are things worse? Yes and no, Ethan said. He sat down across from him. They're clearer. That's different from worse. Noah considered this with his fork. Clear is better than confused. Usually, Ethan looked at his son. I'm going to tell you something, and I need you to understand it's not something to worry about. It's just something that's true, okay? Noah looked at him. We might have to make some changes, Ethan said, to how we live. Some things might look different for a while. Like what things? I don't know exactly yet, but I want you to hear it from me instead of from somewhere else. Noah was quiet for a moment, processing with that particular seriousness he had. Like moving, he said. Maybe. From this house? Possibly. I don't know yet. Noah looked at his plate. He was quiet long enough that Ethan couldn't read it. Couldn't tell if he was about to cry or about to say something startlingly reasonable or something in between. Okay, Noah said. Ethan waited. I mean, I like this house, Noah said carefully. But it's a lot of house. He looked up. Marcus said once that you have 7 bedrooms. We don't use 7 bedrooms. Ethan looked at his son. No, he said. We definitely don't use 7 bedrooms. So, Noah shrugged, with the careful nonchalance of a kid trying to be brave about something. It's okay, He stopped. Will we still be in the same neighborhood? Same school? I'll do everything I can to make sure of that, Ethan said. I promise you that specifically. Noah nodded. He ate more eggs. He seemed to be working something out internally, and then he said, Dad, why did you do the stupid thing? The one you said, with the money. Ethan thought about this. Because I was angry and I wanted to win, he said. And I didn't stop to think about whether winning was worth what it was going to cost. Why not? Because I don't usually stop. He looked at his coffee. I move. Moving feels like control. When I stop, He paused. He wasn't sure he wanted to finish this sentence to his 8-year-old, except that his 8-year-old was looking at him with those eyes and seemed like he was actually going to hear whatever came next. When I stop, there's just the stuff I don't know how to deal with, so I don't stop. Noah was quiet. I know that's not... It's because of Mom, Noah said. Not a question, just a statement, quiet and matter-of-fact, the way kids sometimes say the thing that adults have been carefully not saying because kids haven't yet learned that some things are supposed to be harder to name. The kitchen was very quiet. Yeah, Ethan said. Partly, yeah. Noah looked at his plate. Me too sometimes, he said. I just play video games instead of think about it. He paused. Maria says that's avoidance. Maria says that to you? She says it to herself, but I hear her. He stood up and took his plate to the sink, which he did without being asked, which Ethan noticed and didn't comment on. I think maybe we're both kind of bad at the sad stuff. Ethan sat at the kitchen table and did not say anything because there was nothing to say that would improve on that. I'm going to Jalen's, Noah said. He's got the new thing we've been waiting for. Is that okay? Yeah, be back by 4. Okay. He grabbed his jacket from the hook by the door. Dad? Yeah? The thing you said, about stopping instead of moving? Maybe try it sometime. He zipped up his jacket. It might not be as bad as you think. He left, and the door closed, and Ethan sat alone in the kitchen with the breakfast dishes and the November light coming through the window, which was pale and without drama, just light, the ordinary kind. He sat there for longer than he'd sat still in a very long time. He thought about Lily Harper. He had been thinking about her in circles for days, always through the lens of strategy, what she wanted, what she was doing, what her position meant for his options. He had not, until this moment, sitting alone in the kitchen, thought about her as just a person who had made a choice. She'd seen a kid about to lose his job over nothing. She'd stepped forward. She'd paid for it with her own. And then he thought about the 30 days, about Danny still employed, about the management company maintaining operations. She had not, despite having every financial reason to let Bellerose go dark and everyone in it go scramble, done that. She kept the restaurant running. She kept the staff employed. She took his money out of the equation and left the people in place. That was not the behavior of someone who wanted to destroy things. That was the behavior of someone who wanted to correct something specific. He thought about what Foss had said. What does she actually want? He thought he was beginning to understand. On Monday morning, he did something that Cole had not advised and Foss had not suggested, and Marcus had gently implied might be a mistake. He wrote a letter, not through his attorney, not through intermediaries, just a letter, typed by himself on his laptop in his office with the door closed, to Lily Harper directly. It was not a long letter. He was not, despite everything, good at long letters, and he was suspicious of length in personal correspondence as a vehicle for saying less while using more words. He wrote 3 paragraphs. The first acknowledged the violation of the covenant provision without qualification or excuse. He had made a decision using loan proceeds in a manner that violated the terms of his agreement, and that was a factual matter, and he was not disputing it. The second paragraph was different from anything he'd written in a professional context in years, because it simply said, what I did at Bellerose 3 weeks ago was wrong, not the loan violation. The other thing, using the resources I had to publicly humiliate you in response to something you did that was right. The busboy's name was Danny Park, and his father was injured and he needed that job. You were the only person in that room who said so. I made you pay for it, and I should not have. The third paragraph said he understood her position and was not writing to ask her to reverse it, and that he would deal with the consequences of his own decisions. He was writing because she deserved a direct acknowledgement, not a legal response. He read it back 3 times. It sounded, on the third reading, like himself, which was either the right thing or a problem, and he couldn't tell which. He sent it through the bank's official correspondence address with her name on it. Then he closed his laptop and went back to the asset inventory. He was not expecting a response, and he did not get one that day. He told himself that was fine. He went back to work. The response came 48 hours later in the form of a single email from a personal address he didn't recognize. No company header, no formal sign-off. Mr. Vaughn, I received your letter. I'm not going to pretend I wasn't surprised by it. I'll think about what you've said. LH. He read it twice. Then he put his phone face down and went back to the financial spreadsheet he'd been working on, and he did not allow himself to spend more than 20 minutes trying to decode 7 words and an initial. She'd said she would think about it. He would wait. He was learning, slowly and with significant difficulty, that waiting was a thing he was capable of. What he didn't know was that Lily Harper was sitting in her apartment on the Upper West Side, reading his letter for the 4th time when she sent that response, with the leaky faucet still going in the background and a cup of tea that was getting cold because she'd forgotten about it. She had read it the first time standing in the kitchen at 7 in the morning and had put it down and gone to work. which for her that week meant not Belarus but the Park Avenue office, where she had been spending increasingly more of her time as the Harper Continental Board navigated the Vaughn situation and the associated press attention. The press attention was considerable. Manhattan's billionaire banker Waitress was one headline that she had found both accurate and deeply annoying. Her photograph had appeared in the financial section of 3 papers, the same headshot that had been taken for a Harper Continental Board announcement 4 years ago, which she had never particularly liked. Maya had called her from Chicago to say she had become, in Maya's words, some kind of folk hero for people who hate their boss, which was not a role Lily had applied for and didn't quite know how to feel about. The Belarus staff had sent her a card, a physical card, handwritten, with all their signatures. Olivier's handwriting was extremely neat. Danny Park had written, "Thank you for everything. I'll pay it forward." Marco the cook had drawn a small pot with steam coming off it, which she thought was probably meant to be a heart, but also might have been a pot. She'd put the card on her kitchen table and looked at it for a while. She didn't regret what she'd done. She'd examined that question carefully and honestly, the way she'd been taught to examine financial decisions. Remove the emotion, look at the structure, assess the actual outcome. The outcome was, the covenant had been violated. The enforcement action was legally justified. Ethan Vaughn had used borrowed money to pursue a personal vendetta, and the terms of the loan were clear. And also, a man's empire was collapsing. Not just an abstraction. People worked at Vaughn Development. The East Side Tower alone had a construction crew of several hundred people. Suppliers, contractors, subcontractors. Businesses that existed because that project existed. The 30-day window was real. She had given it deliberately. But the 30 days was running, and the picture she was watching through her oversight of the bank's exposure was not comfortable. She was not, despite everything, comfortable with collateral damage, which was what Carla had said to her on Thursday in the Park Avenue office, with less delicacy than usual. At some point, Carla had said, standing in the doorway with a folder, the question stops being about principle and starts being about math. How much damage do we absorb trying to make a point? It's not about making a point, Lily had said. I know. Carla set the folder on the desk. But I've been watching the East Side project financials and the construction timeline implications of a prolonged called loan situation. And Lily, there are people downstream of this who didn't spill water on anyone. Lily had looked at the folder without opening it. I know that, she said. I know you know. A pause. I also know you're one of the fairest people I've ever worked for. So I'm just naming it. She'd read his letter that night for the first time, standing in the kitchen. She was reading it for the 4th time when she sent the response. She hadn't made a decision yet. She was still thinking about the shape of it, the architecture of what was possible within the terms of what she actually wanted. She didn't want to destroy Vaughn Development. She was not, if she was being precise, trying to ruin a man. She was trying to answer a specific kind of behavior with a specific kind of consequence. And the question was whether the consequence had made its point or whether it needed more time. She picked up her phone and called Maya. Hey, Maya said, picking up immediately. You okay? I'm thinking, Lily said. She was at the kitchen table with the cold tea and the letter on the screen in front of her. I need someone to think with. Okay? Maya's voice shifted into the mode that meant she was actually paying attention. Talk to me. He wrote me a letter, Lily said. Not through lawyers. Him, direct. A pause. And? It was... She stopped. It was honest. He admitted the violation, no qualifications, and he admitted the other thing, the restaurant, what he tried to do. She looked at the screen. He said I was right, that the busboy was right, that he shouldn't have... She stopped again. Lily, I know. What are you actually asking me? She looked at the letter. She thought about the 30 days, and Carla's folder, and the construction crew, and Danny's card on the table, and the question of whether the point had been made. I'm asking, she said slowly, what happens when the person who did the wrong thing actually seems to understand what they did? Maya was quiet for a moment. That's a different situation than the one you started in. Yes. What do you want to happen? Lily looked at the window. The city outside was dark, and the faucet was still going, and the tea was cold. I want him to actually understand it, she said. Not because it gets him something, actually understand. And do you think he does? She thought about the letter, the second paragraph. Not careful, not calculated. Just a man writing down something he knew was true and sending it without his attorney's signature at the bottom. I think he might be starting to, she said. Then you have a decision to make, Maya said. And it's yours. Not the bank's, not the board's. Yours. Lily sat with that for a moment. I know, she said. Outside the window, November moved through the city the way it always did, indifferent to the particular weight of anyone's evening, and the faucet kept going, and Lily Harper sat at her kitchen table alone, holding the letter and its question and the specific, complicated responsibility of being the person who decided what came next. She did not call the super about the faucet that night. She had been meaning to for 6 weeks, and she still wasn't ready. But she opened her laptop, and she began carefully and without rushing to think about what a different structure might look like. The restructuring memo from Janet Foss arrived on a Tuesday morning, 11 days into the 30-day window, and it was 43 pages long and read like a clinical description of controlled demolition. Ethan read it at his desk in one sitting, which took 2 hours, and when he was done, he sat back and looked at the ceiling for a while. The memo laid out 3 scenarios. The first required a bridge lender coming in at a rate that Foss described as aggressive but not impossible. She had identified 2 institutional candidates who had not yet declined and had not yet agreed, which was a specific kind of limbo that meant nothing except that the door wasn't locked. The second scenario was partial restructuring with significant asset liquidation: the townhouse, the Connecticut property, the art, the car collection, a secondary commercial holding in Brooklyn that Ethan had owned for 7 years and had always intended to develop and never gotten around to. That scenario preserved the East Side Tower but left Vaughn development substantially smaller, leaner, and operating at a scale that would have been unrecognizable to the version of Ethan who'd sat down at Bellerose 3 weeks ago. The third scenario was the word nobody had used yet in his presence, but that was present in the subtext of every conversation he'd had in the past 11 days, in the space between what people said and what they meant. He closed the memo. He called Cole. Scenario 2, he said, when Cole picked up. A pause. You're sure? Start moving on the townhouse. The words came out even. He'd made the decision somewhere in the middle of page 31, he thought, though he wasn't entirely sure when it had stopped being a question and become a fact. Get the Connecticut buyer to a signed agreement this week. I'll deal with the rest of the liquidation list on my end. The townhouse takes time, Cole said carefully. The market isn't, I know the market. List it anyway. And Richard, he stopped. I need you to find somewhere for Noah and me to land. An apartment. Good school district, same area if possible. I told him I'd try. A longer pause this time. Okay, Cole said, and his voice had shifted into something quieter, less attorney, and more just a person talking to another person. I'll make some calls today. Thank you. He hung up and sat for a moment with his hands flat on the desk. The office was quiet. Through the window, the city was doing its Tuesday thing, indifferent and continuous. He thought about Noah saying, "It's a lot of house. We don't use 7 bedrooms." He thought about how 8-year-olds had a way of making the complicated simple, not because they didn't understand complexity, but because they hadn't yet learned to be afraid of simple things. He called Marcus next and gave him a list of things to do that would have sounded, taken individually, like small administrative decisions, and taken together sounded like a man systematically disassembling the physical structure of a life he'd been building for a decade. The car collection would go to auction. He kept the Escalade because Gerald needed work and Gerald had a family. The art pieces would go to a specialist firm for private sale, which would take longer but return better value. He wanted it all documented carefully, not for optics, but because he intended to understand exactly what it cost, every dollar of it, because understanding exactly what things cost was the only way to stop making the same mistakes. Marcus listened without interrupting, which was unusual for Marcus, who had opinions and generally expressed them. When Ethan finished, Marcus said, "Okay," and then after a pause, "Are you all right?" "I'm fine." "I know you say that when—" "I'm actually fine, Marcus." He looked at the window. "I'm doing the thing where I stop instead of move. It's uncomfortable, but I'm fine." He heard Marcus process this. Right, Marcus said. I'll get started. What he didn't tell Marcus, because it wasn't something that belonged in a to-do list, was that the previous night he'd done something he hadn't done since the first few months after Sarah died, which was go through the box in the back of the closet. Not for any specific reason. He'd been in the closet looking for a different document folder and had simply found himself standing there with the box in his hands, and he'd sat down on the bedroom floor with it, which was not a thing he'd planned. The box had photographs, letters she'd written him when they were in different cities during the first year they were together, actual physical letters because she'd thought email was impersonal for things that mattered, a program from a concert they'd gone to on their third date, a small pressed flower that he couldn't remember the origin of but that she had clearly saved for a reason, a birthday card with her handwriting on it that said, characteristically, "You are infuriatingly driven and occasionally impossible, and I love you for reasons that I think might be a personality flaw of mine. Happy 30, S." He'd sat on the floor for a long time. Not crying exactly, but not crying either. Something in between, which was probably the more accurate description of grief at 4 years remove. Not the acute thing anymore, but not absent either. More like weather, present, changed in character, something you move through rather than under. He'd put everything back carefully and sat with the box closed in his lap for a while, and then he'd put it back on the shelf and gone to bed, and slept. Somehow, better than he had in 2 weeks. He thought about this, sitting at his desk on Tuesday morning, and decided that Noah had been right about the stopping. On day 14 of the 30-day window, Ethan received a phone call from a number he didn't recognize that turned out to be Lily Harper's personal cell. He was in a meeting with Foss and Cole when it came through, and he stepped out into the hallway to take it, because he'd told Marcus to flag that number if it ever appeared. "Mr. Vaughn," she said. She sounded, as she always did, like someone who had decided before calling exactly what she was going to say and had not included anything extra. "I want to meet, in person, not through attorneys, just you and me." He leaned against the hallway wall. "Okay," he said. "Not to negotiate," she said clearly. "I want you to understand that going in, I'm not meeting to make a deal. I want to have a conversation." "I understand." A pause. "Wednesday. There's a coffee place on Amsterdam Avenue near 79th. Small. Not the kind of place you'd normally go to. 11 o'clock. He almost said he had a board call at 11:30, and then he didn't. "I'll be there," he said. "Okay." She was about to hang up, and then she said, "Your letter, the second paragraph." He waited. "I read it a lot of times," she said. "Not with any particular emotion, just as a statement of fact. I just wanted you to know that." She hung up. He stood in the hallway outside Cole's conference room for a moment, with the dead phone in his hand and the faint sound of traffic from somewhere below and the building's HVAC doing its quiet work in the ceiling. He went back into the meeting. "Everything okay?" Foss asked. "Fine," he said. "Where were we?" The coffee place on Amsterdam Avenue was exactly as she'd described. Small, slightly cramped, with the specific unpolished quality of a neighborhood place that had been there long enough to stop caring about its own aesthetic. A handwritten menu on a chalkboard, 4 small tables, a counter with an espresso machine that looked like it had been repaired at least twice. The kind of place where the coffee was actually good, because that was the entire point. Ethan arrived 4 minutes early because arriving late was not something he did. He ordered a black coffee because he didn't know what else to order and sat at the table farthest from the window. He was wearing, deliberately, no suit, just dark jeans and a gray sweater, which was the closest thing he had to not performing being Ethan Vaughn, though he was aware that this, too, was a performance of a kind. Lily came in at 11 exactly, in a coat he'd seen before, the dark wool one from that evening at Belarus, with her hair down, which he realized he'd only ever seen pulled back. She looked different outside the restaurant context, more complete somehow, like a person rather than a role. She sat down across from him, unfolding her coat, and looked at him directly in the way she always did, that particular steadiness that he'd found disconcerting the first time and now just found true. "Thank you for coming," he said. "I asked you here," she said. "So." She wrapped both hands around a cup of tea she'd ordered at the counter before sitting. "I want to start by saying something, and I need you to just hear it, not respond to it immediately." "Okay, what you did in that restaurant, both times, was a demonstration of the kind of power that works through humiliation, not through competence, not through merit, through the ability to make someone feel small in front of other people. She looked at him. I have been in rooms my entire life where that kind of power was the only currency that moved. Boardrooms, banking floors, rooms full of men who used it constantly, not even noticing they were using it, because it had been normal for so long. She paused. Danny Park was 17 years old, and he bumped a chair. And your immediate response was to end his income in front of a room full of people who could do nothing about it. Ethan said nothing. She'd asked him not to respond yet. He held that. I've thought a lot about why I stepped in, Lily continued. She was looking at her tea. It's not usually what I do. I have a very specific arrangement with myself about staying out of things. I've kept it for 3 years. A pause. But there's a version of staying quiet that isn't neutral. There's a version where you're just complicit. And I've been on the receiving end of that kind of silence too many times to be okay with adding to it. She looked up. So I said something, and then you bought the restaurant to fire me. And I made a financial decision based on a clear contractual violation. She paused. I want you to know that I didn't plan it from the beginning. I know it must look like I set a trap. I didn't. I read the file because I needed to understand what you were actually capable of doing. And then you did the thing, and the violation was real, and I acted on it. She held his gaze. I want to be honest with you about that because you were honest with me. He nodded once. Okay, she said. You can talk now? He was quiet for a moment, not because he didn't have things to say, but because he wanted to say them in the right order. The trap question, he said. I stopped wondering about that around day 5. It doesn't matter whether it was planned. The violation was real. I did it. The consequences followed the action. He looked at his coffee. What I've been thinking about is the thing underneath that. The reason I walked back into that restaurant at all. He paused. I've been running on a particular kind of momentum for 4 years, since my wife died. Moving fast enough that the other stuff, the things I haven't dealt with, can't catch up. And in that mode, everything becomes about winning, about control, because control is the only thing that feels like safety. He looked up at her. That night at Bellerose the first time, you challenged me in front of people I was trying to impress. And the thing that moved in me wasn't anger exactly. It was fear. And I converted it into power because that's what I know how to do with fear. Lily was quiet, watching him. That's not an excuse, he said. I'm not offering it as an excuse. It's just, you said you wanted honesty, so. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, How old is your son? He blinked at the shift. 8? What's his name? Noah. She nodded slightly. Does he know how bad it is? I told him it was bad. I told him we'd probably have to make some changes. He paused. He told me we had 7 bedrooms and didn't use most of them, so moving was fine. Something shifted in Lily's expression, not a smile exactly, but close. The kind of face you make when a fact is simultaneously sad and reassuring. Smart kid, she said. He is. He looked at his coffee. He told me to try stopping instead of moving. He said it might not be as bad as I thought. Lily was quiet. He was right, Ethan said. It is bad, but it's survivable. That's different from what I thought before I stopped. The coffee place had filled up slightly around them. A woman with a stroller, 2 people with laptops, a man reading an actual newspaper at the counter. The espresso machine hissed. Someone laughed at the other table. The ordinary Wednesday morning texture of a neighborhood that didn't know or care about any of this. I'm going to tell you what I've been thinking, Lily said. And again, I need you to just hear it. Okay, I've been looking at the East Side project. The full file, not just the lending structure. She paused. It's a good project. The design is good. The location is right. The market case is solid. There are 300 and something construction jobs attached to it, and about 40 full-time Vaughan development positions, and a supply chain that runs through probably 20 small to mid-sized businesses in the city. She looked at him. None of those people spilled water on your jacket. He said nothing. She'd asked him to hear it. I also looked at the Harlem Conversion Project, she continued. That one I care about more personally, actually, because it's 80 units of mixed-income housing, and Manhattan needs that more than it needs another luxury tower, but that's a separate conversation. She paused. The point is, I looked at what happens downstream if the 30 days runs out and enforcement proceedings begin. And She stopped. It's a lot of damage that doesn't belong to the argument we're actually having. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said something that he genuinely had not anticipated. I'm not going to reverse the loan call. He held still. The violation was real and the legal position is clear, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise, she said. But I'm willing to consider a restructured repayment arrangement on the primary East Side facility. Not forgiveness, not a reset. A structured agreement with specific terms, including compliance monitoring, that gives the project a real path to completion. She looked at him directly. That's not charity. That's what a lender does when the underlying asset has value, and the borrower has shown some indication of changed awareness. He was very still. The other facilities are separate conversations, she said. Some of them I think need to be wound down or transferred to other lenders because the covenant breach created a trust issue that I don't think a payment arrangement fixes. But the primary facility, the East Side Tower, I think that one can be restructured. A pause. If you want it. He looked at her for a long moment. He was aware of a lot of things simultaneously. The complexity of what she'd just offered, the conditions embedded in it, the fact that it was real, and he should treat it as real, and not as strategy, not as an angle, just as what it was. Why? He said. She looked at him. Why am I offering this? Yes. She thought for a moment, not performing the thinking, actually doing it right there. Because what I wanted was for you to understand that there's a difference between power that builds things and power that just needs to feel big. She paused. And I think you might actually understand that now. Not because of what's happened to your finances, but because of… She paused again. The second paragraph of your letter, the part about Danny. He was quiet. You didn't mention the loans in that paragraph, she said. You didn't mention the consequences to yourself. You just said it was wrong. That's a different thing. She looked at her tea. So, yes, I'm willing to talk about a structure that lets the East Side project continue, because that's the right outcome for everyone downstream of this, and because… She stopped. Because, he said, because I didn't come to New York to be in the business of watching things collapse. I came here to be a person carrying plates and having some peace. And somehow I ended up in the middle of all of this, and I'd like it to end up somewhere that isn't just wreckage. He looked at her. There was something in the plainness of that, the absence of any attempt to make it sound important or heroic, that was more honest than most things he'd heard in boardrooms and negotiating sessions combined. Okay, he said. Okay, you'll consider the restructuring terms? Okay to all of it, he said. And Lily. He used her name consciously, not as a social gesture, but because it was her name and she deserved to be addressed by it. I want to say something that isn't a negotiating position. She waited. I'm sorry, he said. Not the version in the letter, to your face directly. For the restaurant. Both times. For using money as a weapon and thinking that was acceptable because I had enough of it to do so. He paused. That's it. That's what I wanted to say. Lily looked at him across the small table in the unremarkable coffee shop on Amsterdam Avenue for a moment, and her expression was something he couldn't entirely read. Not warm, not cold, somewhere in that difficult middle space where real things happen. I heard it, she said. Not it's okay. Not I forgive you. Just I heard it. Which was, he thought, more honest and more accurate than either of those things would have been. They spent another 40 minutes at that table. What followed was not a negotiation, she had been precise about that, but something more like a mapping. She explained what a restructured facility might require in terms of compliance oversight, how the monitoring would work, what the revised payment timeline could look like. He asked specific questions about the terms, and she answered them with the thoroughness of someone who had thought about this carefully before arriving. He didn't push. He didn't look for angles. He just listened and asked and clarified because listening and asking was what the situation required. And he was trying, with significant difficulty, to do what situations required. At one point she said, "You'll need to bring in a co-developer on the East Side project. someone with independent capitalization. The bank will require it as a condition of the restructured facility. He looked at the table. Nakamura, he said. She looked at him. The Japanese consortium, he said. They haven't fully committed to leaving. If I can give them a restructured lending framework and a compliance monitoring arrangement that gives them confidence in the project governance, that might actually be the thing that keeps them in. He paused. It changes the project. It changes my control over it. Yes, she said. It does. He was quiet. Is that something you can live with? She asked. He thought about it honestly. A year ago, 3 months ago, the idea of sharing control of the East Side project, his project, the one he'd designed and fought for and invested 4 years of his life into, would have been essentially unthinkable. Control was the system. Control was safety. You didn't share control. You built until you didn't need to. Yes, he said. I think I can. She nodded. They sat for a moment without talking, and the coffee place did its ordinary thing around them. And somewhere in the middle of it, Ethan realized that this was the most straightforwardly honest conversation he had had in a professional context in a very long time, possibly ever, and that it had happened in a 4-table coffee shop on Amsterdam Avenue with bad lighting and a repaired espresso machine. Can I ask you something? He said. Probably. The restaurant. Bellerose. He paused. You're still running it through the management company. Yes. What are you going to do with it? She looked at her cup for a moment. I'm not going to keep it, she said. That was never the point. She paused. I have something in mind. I'm still working out the details. He looked at her. Something good? She considered. Something right, she said, which I think is better than good. He didn't ask what it was. It wasn't his to know yet, and he understood that. When they stood up to leave, the coffee place had turned over to a slightly different crowd. Lunch approaching, different people at the tables, the rhythm of the neighborhood going through its ordinary rotations. On the sidewalk outside, Lily put her coat on and looked at him in the November light, which was pale and without opinion. I'll have the bank's legal team send initial restructuring terms to your attorney by end of week, she said. It'll be a starting point, not a final document. I understand. Read it carefully. Don't just send it to Cole. Read it yourself first. I will. She nodded. She was about to turn away, and then she paused. How are you actually doing? She said. Not Ms. Harper asking Mr. Vaughn, just one person asking another. I mean, day to day. How are you doing? He thought about the box in the closet, the bedroom floor, Noah on the stairs in dinosaur pajamas, the 7 bedrooms, Gerald starting the car without being asked, 4 years of watching a man carry something without naming it. Better than I was 2 weeks ago, he said, which is a strange thing to say, given everything. No, she said. I don't think it's strange. She looked at him for a moment. Take care of the kid. Whatever else happens. Yeah, he said. That one I know. She turned and walked west on Amsterdam, and he watched her for a moment. Just a person in a dark coat moving through the city, unremarkable from any distance, which was exactly how she seemed to want it. And then he turned east and started walking. He didn't call Marcus. Not immediately. He walked for about 6 blocks in the November air, hands in his pockets, no phone, no agenda, just the city doing its constant thing around him. He thought about the restructured facility and what it meant. The co-developer requirement. Nakamura. The reduced scale of what Vaughn development would look like on the other side of this. The townhouse already listed and the apartment Cole was finding, and the 7 bedrooms they didn't use. He thought about Sarah's birthday card. Infuriatingly driven and occasionally impossible. The pressed flower he couldn't identify. The letters from a year when they were young and the world felt like it had everything still in it. He stopped at an intersection and waited for the light. There was a woman next to him with a small boy, maybe 5 or 6, who was looking up at the traffic light with tremendous concentration, like the changing of colors was a significant event requiring witness. Ethan watched the kid watching the light. The light changed. The woman took the boy's hand and they stepped off the curb. The boy looked away from the traffic light and immediately found something else to examine with the same focused intensity. A crack in the pavement, a paper cup, the particular shine of a wet manhole cover. Everything interesting, everything worth looking at. Ethan stepped off the curb and crossed the street with the rest of them. He had a call with Cole to make. He had Foss's scenarios to revisit in light of the morning's conversation. He had the Nakamura relationship to navigate carefully, and the asset liquidation moving, and the apartment search, and the restructuring terms coming by end of week that he would read himself first. He had work to do. The kind that was harder than building, because it required him to understand what things actually cost, and to pay those costs without looking for a way around them. But first he pulled out his phone and sent one text. To Marcus. December 14th. Block it. The whole day. Noah's school thing. It stays. He put the phone back in his pocket. He kept walking. The city moved around him, enormous and indifferent and full of the ordinary life of people who were carrying things and doing the next thing and getting from one place to another. And Ethan Vaughn moved through it and did not feel, for the first time in a long time, like he was running, just walking, one block at a time, in the direction of whatever came next. The restructuring terms arrived on a Friday, 8 days after the coffee shop meeting, in a document that was 61 pages long and written in the careful, dense language of institutional finance. Cole called Ethan the moment his copy came through, voice already in preparation mode, already sorting through which sections needed immediate attention and which were standard boilerplate and which required negotiation. Ethan told him he'd call back. He printed the document himself at the office printer, which was something he hadn't done in years because that was what assistants were for, and he took it to the small conference room at the end of the hall, the one nobody used because the view was of a brick wall rather than the skyline. And he closed the door and read it, all 61 pages. Himself. With a pen, marking things as he went, writing questions in the margins in his own handwriting. It took 3 hours. Lily had been precise about what she'd told him in the coffee shop. The terms were not generous. She had been clear that this wasn't charity, and the document held to that. The repayment structure was extended but structured around performance benchmarks that were genuinely achievable if the project moved forward cleanly. The compliance monitoring provision required quarterly reporting to the bank's institutional oversight team, with a Harper Continental representative holding observer status on the project governance committee. The co-developer requirement was stated plainly. Ethan had 90 days from signing to bring in a qualified co-developer with independent capitalization sufficient to satisfy the bank's risk threshold. That was the Nakamura conversation he still had to have. There were 2 provisions he wanted to push back on. One related to the interest rate step-up in a default scenario that he thought was punitive past a certain point, and one procedural requirement around the compliance reporting timeline that would create a genuinely unworkable quarterly crunch given the construction schedule. These were legitimate objections, not negotiating for the sake of it, and he wrote them out clearly in his notes. Everything else he was prepared to accept. He called Cole back at 4:15. Okay, he said. I have 2 specific pushbacks. Everything else I'm signing. A pause. That's, Ethan, there are at least 6 other provisions that I would want to. 2 pushbacks. Write them up cleanly and send them back to Harper Continental's legal team today. Don't add anything else. Don't negotiate terms I haven't asked you to negotiate. Another pause. Longer. Cole had represented Ethan for 6 years and had a deep familiarity with the way he operated in contract situations, which historically involved identifying every possible point of leverage and pressing each one methodically until the other side was tired. This was not that. All right, Cole said carefully. 2 pushbacks. Thank you. The Nakamura call, Cole said. Have you? Tonight, Ethan said. I'm calling Tokyo tonight. He did. At 11:30, which was early afternoon in Tokyo, he called Hiroshi Nakamura's direct line, not through the consortium's legal team, not through intermediaries. And when Nakamura picked up, Ethan told him everything. The complete picture, the restructuring terms, the co-developer requirement, what the project would look like on the other side of this, and what it would require from both of them. He didn't soften it, and he didn't sell it. He just laid it out the way you lay things out, when you've decided that honesty is the only currency left with value. When he finished, there was a silence on the line that lasted long enough to be meaningful. Then Nakamura said, "You are asking me to come in as a partner, not just an equity investor." Yes. That is a different relationship than what we originally discussed. Yes, it's more exposure for you, more involvement, but it's also more control, and the project is genuinely sound. The fundamentals haven't changed." He paused. "I think it's a better arrangement, honestly. I should have structured it this way from the beginning. I had too much control and not enough accountability, and this is what that produced." Another silence. "That is an unusual thing for a developer to say about his own project," Nakamura said. "I know." A pause. "I will need to present this to my consortium. I will need 2 weeks. I have 90 days on the co-developer requirement. Take the time you need." "Mr. Vaughn," Nakamura said, and something in his tone had shifted slightly, still measured, still precise, but with a quality underneath it that was almost, not quite, warm. "I appreciated your honesty when we spoke before. I appreciate it again now." "Thank you for staying in the conversation," Ethan said. "You didn't have to." "No," Nakamura agreed. "I did not have to." A brief pause. "I will be in touch within 2 weeks." He hung up and sat in the quiet of his office. The city below was doing its late-night thing, thinned out but never entirely still. He looked at the skyline, his buildings visible from here, permanent against the dark sky, shapes he'd added to a city that had been adding shapes for centuries and would keep adding them long after everyone in this story was gone. He turned off the desk lamp and went home. The apartment Cole had found was on the Upper East Side, 4 blocks from the townhouse, which meant Noah's school stayed and his neighborhood stayed, and the things that mattered most to a kid's daily life were uninterrupted. It was the 3rd floor of a pre-war building, 3 bedrooms, good light from the south-facing windows, a kitchen that was half the size of the one they were leaving and would require some adjustment, a small 2nd bedroom for Noah, and a slightly larger one that was technically the master, and that Ethan suspected would not feel like any kind of master for a long time, but that was livable. Noah walked through it the first time with the systematic attention of someone taking inventory, opening closets and testing light switches and standing in each room for a moment, as if assessing its quality as a space. In the end, he stood in the kitchen and said, "It smells like other people." "It's a new apartment," Ethan said. "It'll smell like us eventually." Noah thought about this. "The building has a doorman," he observed. "That's kind of like having Gerald, but for the whole building." "Somewhat," Ethan said. "I like the window in my room." Noah went back to look at it again. "I can see the street. At the townhouse, I could only see the garden. Is the street better?" "More things happen on the street." He looked out for a moment. "Yeah, I like this." They moved on the first Saturday of December. Not with the full logistics infrastructure of a wealthy man's household relocation. That version of moving was 3 weeks behind them, had already happened with movers and inventory and the careful packing of art that was now in a storage facility waiting for the specialist firm. This was the second move, the actual one. Boxes of personal things, Noah's books and games and the small irreplaceable items of a kid's bedroom, Ethan's clothing and his desk and the box from the back of the closet, which he packed himself and carried down the stairs himself and placed in the back of the Escalade with more care than he'd packed anything in years. Gerald drove them. At the new apartment, Gerald helped carry boxes up 3 flights because the elevator was old and slow. And Gerald was the kind of person who just did that without it needing to be discussed. When everything was in and the boxes were stacked in their approximate rooms, and Noah had immediately unpacked his gaming setup with the focused efficiency of someone who knows his priorities, Gerald stood in the hallway with his coat still on and said, "The place is good, Mr. Vaughn. You think so?" "More human-sized," Gerald said. Not unkindly, just as a statement. Ethan looked at the hallway, which was narrower than what they'd left, and had a light fixture that was slightly crooked and wallpaper that was almost but not quite white. "Yeah," he said. "I think so too." Gerald left, and Ethan stood in the kitchen of the human-sized apartment and heard Noah in the next room explaining the gaming setup to nobody, which meant he was doing a video he recorded for himself when he was working through something, and the sound of it, ordinary and small and completely itself, was one of the better sounds Ethan had heard in a long time. He made dinner. Not calling in, not having it delivered, actually making it. Pasta, which was the extent of his repertoire, but which he made competently enough. And Noah came to the table without being asked twice, which was a small miracle. And they ate in the new kitchen that smelled like other people with boxes stacked against the wall and nowhere to put anything yet. "Dad," Noah said, pasta halfway to his mouth, Are we going to be okay? Ethan looked at him. Yes, he said. Different than before, but okay. Noah nodded and ate his pasta. Different is okay, Noah said. Different is just different. On the 14th of December, Ethan was in the third row of the Hudson Elementary School winter performance, which was held in the gymnasium with folding chairs and a banner that said Winter Celebration in letters cut from construction paper, slightly uneven, the work of several pairs of small hands. There was a program, also printed on paper, also slightly crooked. A teacher was playing a keyboard in the corner. Half the parents were holding phones up to record, and the other half were holding phones up to record while pretending they weren't. Ethan had his hands in his lap. Noah was in the second group to perform, a thing involving recorders and some amount of choreography that the kids had clearly been told about more recently than they'd been told about the recorder part, because the choreography was more confident than the music. But Noah looked up once from the stage and found Ethan in the third row, and something moved across his face that was not surprise exactly, but was close to it. The specific expression of a kid who was not entirely sure the thing they'd been told would happen was actually going to happen, and then it did, and the relief of that was visible and unguarded and completely honest. Ethan held up one hand in acknowledgement. Noah looked back at his recorder and played the next note, which was approximately correct. After the performance, there was a reception in the hallway with cookies that parents had brought and juice boxes that someone had stacked in a cooler. Noah found him immediately, still holding the recorder, and said, "You came." "I came." "The whole time?" "Third row the whole time." Noah looked at the recorder. "We only practiced that song for like 3 weeks. The hard part was the choreography." "The choreography was impressive," Ethan said with complete sincerity. Noah looked up at him with the evaluating expression of an 8-year-old assessing whether an adult is being genuine or polite, and apparently concluded genuine because he said, "Thanks," and then immediately got distracted by a classmate who needed to tell him something important about a video game and ran off. And Ethan stood in the hallway of an elementary school with a juice box someone had handed him and watched his kid move through a crowd of other kids with the fluid, unself-conscious energy of childhood, and felt something that wasn't happiness exactly, but was in the same family. The feeling of being in the right place at the right time, which was a feeling he had not had nearly enough of. He stayed for the whole reception. He talked to another parent about the neighborhood, about the new coffee place on 79th. Small, he said, good coffee, worth trying. And about nothing in particular, in the ordinary way of people sharing a hallway. He ate 2 cookies, which were store-bought and slightly stale and perfectly fine. He was not, on that December 14th, a Manhattan billionaire. He was a man at his kid's school performance eating a bad cookie in a gymnasium hallway. It was a smaller life, measured by most of the metrics he'd used for the past 10 years. He was finding, with something that resembled surprise, that smaller was not the same as lesser. The restructuring agreement was signed on the 18th of December. 2 pushbacks accepted by the bank with minor modifications, the remainder of the terms standing as drafted. Ethan signed it at Cole's conference room table with Cole and Foss present and a Harper Continental representative present, and no particular ceremony, just the practical work of a pen moving through a long document on every page that required it. When it was done, Cole shook his hand. Foss gave him a nod that communicated professional respect in the specific compressed way professional respect is communicated by people who don't waste words on it. The Harper Continental representative, a careful man named Singh, who had said perhaps 12 words the entire meeting, collected the signed documents and left. Ethan sat for a moment after the room had mostly emptied. Cole was still there, gathering papers. "How do you feel?" Cole asked. Ethan thought about it. "Like I signed a document that commits me to doing things the right way for the next several years or face consequences I can't afford." He paused. "Which is apparently what accountability feels like from the inside." Cole looked at him over the top of his reading glasses. "That's growth, Ethan." "Don't push it," Ethan said, and Cole laughed. Actually laughed, which was something that didn't happen very often in that conference room. Nakamura's consortium confirmed their participation as co-developer on the 22nd of December, 11 days inside the 90-day window. The terms were different from the original equity arrangement. Nakamura had more say, more formal oversight, a co-chair position on the project governance committee. Ethan had less unilateral control than he'd had over any project in 6 years. He read through the consortium's proposed terms carefully, made 3 clarifying notes, accepted everything else, and sent it back within 24 hours. Nakamura called personally to confirm receipt. "I want to say something," Nakamura said, "outside the formal correspondence." "Please," Ethan said. "My consortium has worked with many developers in this city over the years. We have seen projects succeed and projects fail. What we have seen less often is a developer who, in the middle of a crisis, becomes more honest rather than less." A pause. "It affected our decision." Ethan was quiet for a moment. "I appreciate you telling me that." "I thought you should know," Nakamura said. "It matters, these things, how a person behaves when they are losing." "Yes," Ethan said. "I'm beginning to understand that." On the 28th of December, which was a quiet Wednesday between holidays when the city was running at about half speed, Ethan received a message from Lily. Not a formal letter, not through counsel. A text to his cell, the same personal number she'd called from before. "Belarus. Tonight at 7, if you can, I want to show you something." He arrived at 7:02, which was as close to on time as he ever managed, and found the restaurant in a state he hadn't expected. Not the formal dinner service of what he'd known it as. The tables were pushed aside, the chairs stacked in one corner, and the space was occupied by most of the restaurant's staff, who were standing around a large table covered in documents, talking in the animated, overlapping way of people who are very excited about something and are trying to be professional about it and mostly failing. Olivier was there, hands no longer clasped behind his back, holding a document and talking to Jordan. Marco from the kitchen was in the corner in his street clothes, which was somehow startling. Ethan had only ever seen him in chef's whites, and this version of Marco was a stocky man in a knit sweatshirt who was apparently very good at explaining legal documents in plain language because 3 other staff members were gathered around listening to him. Danny Park was at the far end of the table, young and alert, reading his own copy of something with the focused concentration of a person encountering a new kind of information and deciding it matters. Lily was standing near the center of the room and turned when he came in. "You came," she said. "You asked." She looked at the room, at the people in it, the documents, the specific quality of the energy, which was not an employee energy, not a staff meeting energy, but something more fundamental and harder to name. "Do you know what's happening here?" she said. "Show me," he said. She walked him to the center table and picked up one of the documents. It was a legal agreement. He recognized the format, with the title at the top reading Belarus Restaurant Cooperative Ownership Agreement and dated the 28th of December. He read the first 2 pages standing there. Lily had transferred Belarus out of the holding that had come to her through the enforcement of the Vaughan loan violation and restructured its ownership as a worker cooperative. The restaurant was being signed over in shares to its employees, weighted by tenure and role, with provisions for future staff participation. Olivier received the largest single share as manager. Marco and the other long-term kitchen staff received substantial shares. The servers, the bartenders, the support staff all had shares. Danny Park, 3 months into his employment, received a smaller share with a vesting structure tied to continued work, a provision that was, according to the document, designed specifically to reward long-term commitment rather than just current employment. Ethan looked up from the document. "You're giving them the restaurant," he said. "I'm transferring legal ownership," she said, "which is different from giving. They'll work it, they'll run it, they'll make decisions about it. The profit or loss is theirs. The future of it is theirs." She paused. "I have 1 seat on the advisory board for 3 years, which was the staff's request, not mine. After that, I'm completely out." "Why the advisory seat if they asked for it?" "Because they've never run a business before, and I have some knowledge that might be useful in the early years. I'll answer questions when asked. I won't direct." She looked at the room. It's their place. It always was, really. They built what it is. George Ferraro opened it, but Olivier and Marco and everyone else kept it alive for over 20 years. The ownership structure just never reflected that. Ethan watched Olivier in the corner, holding his document with both hands, reading something that was apparently remarkable enough to make a man who had spent 30 years being professionally composed look genuinely moved. He watched Danny Park at the end of the table, reading his own copy with that focused attention, and then looking up and catching Ethan's eye across the room, with an expression that was complicated, not hostile, not warm, just the look of someone who is processing many things at once and is choosing, for the moment, to just process them. Ethan looked back at the document in his hands. "The purchase price you paid for the restaurant," Lily said, more quietly. "The acquisition cost that created the covenant violation. That money has been applied to a community development foundation I'm establishing. Small business lending for workers in the restaurant and hospitality industry who don't qualify for traditional financing. First-generation owners, people who've been doing the work for decades but never had the capital to own any of it." She paused. "Your money, applied to that." He looked at her. "I know you didn't intend it that way," she said, "but that's where it went." He was quiet for a moment. He thought about all the things he might say to that, the complicated feelings it produced, the particular texture of having your worst decision redirected into something better than you deserved. He thought about how to respond to that without either performing gratitude or deflecting it. "That's right," he said. That's the right thing to do with it." She looked at him. "I think so too." Across the room, Marco had apparently reached the end of explaining whatever section of the ownership agreement he'd been working through, because he looked up and caught sight of Ethan and went very still for a moment. Then he said, loudly enough to Carrie, "He's the one who fired Lily." The room shifted. A few people looked over. Jordan looked at Ethan with an expression that was not friendly. One of the servers near the window, a woman named Angie, who Ethan recognized from the bar, crossed her arms. It was not a welcoming energy. Lily looked at Ethan. Ethan looked around the room, at the people he had 3 weeks ago, walked in among and used as an audience for a demonstration of what money could make happen, who had stood there, unable to do anything, while he pointed at one of their own and said, "You're fired," who had gone home that night and updated their resumes and called their siblings and worried about their jobs. "That's correct," Ethan said to the room. "I bought this restaurant to fire her. It was a wrong thing to do, and it was done out of pride and not much else." He paused. He was not comfortable doing this, and he did it anyway. "I'm not asking for anything from that. I just want you to know that I know what I did." The room was quiet. Marco looked at him for a long moment. Then he said, "You fired the wrong person and kept Danny." "Yes," Ethan said. "Lily could buy and sell this whole block." "I know that now." Marco looked at Danny, who was watching this exchange with wide eyes. Then he looked back at Ethan. "You're lucky she's a better person than the situation called for." Ethan thought about this. "Yes," he said, "I am." There was a moment, the room holding it, deciding something collectively. And then Olivier said from across the space, "Mr. Vaughn, would you like to sign as a witness? We need 2 external signatures on the cooperative agreement." It was an extraordinary thing to ask. Ethan understood the weight of it. Olivier asking him, specifically, to witness the document that transferred this place into the hands of the people he'd tried to use as props. It was either magnanimous or pointed or both. And in Olivier's case, it might have been both simultaneously, because Olivier was a man with 11 years of accumulated dignity who had watched that night happen and not been able to stop it. "If the staff is comfortable with that," Ethan said. Olivier looked around the room. A few people exchanged glances. Angie uncrossed her arms. Marco shrugged in the particular way of people who have decided to accept something without quite endorsing it. Danny, at the end of the table, looked at Lily, and Lily gave him the smallest nod. And Danny said, "Yeah, okay." Ethan walked to the table. He signed his name on the witness line under the names of 11 people who owned a restaurant. He put the pen down and stepped back. Lily was watching him from across the table with that particular steadiness that he'd been trying to name since the first night in that restaurant, and he thought he understood it now. It wasn't coldness, and it wasn't calculation. It was the look of someone who had decided a long time ago what they actually valued, and had organized everything around that decision, and didn't need external validation to hold it in place. It was the look of someone who was, in the most fundamental sense, settled, not happy in a simple way, not without difficulty or loss, but settled in the sense of knowing who they were. He had spent 4 years in the farthest possible position from settled, moving at the velocity of someone who couldn't afford to stop. He was stopped now. He was also, somehow, still standing. Outside the restaurant, on a December night with the temperature dropping and Christmas a few days off and the city doing its particular holiday version of itself, all lights in motion and people moving in every direction, Ethan stood on the sidewalk and Lily came out a few minutes later pulling on her coat. "Thank you for coming," she said. "Thank you for asking me to be there." She looked down the street for a moment. The cooperative needs to be registered with the city, and there are about 40 administrative steps between now and them actually operating as owners. It's going to be a process. "Olivier will manage it," Ethan said. "He's been managing things for 30 years. "Yes." A slight pause. "He told me tonight that he's been saving to buy this restaurant for 15 years. Never had quite enough. The ownership just sold before he could get there." She paused. "He cried a little when I told him, very quietly. He turned away first." Ethan looked at the restaurant windows, warm and lit, the shapes of people moving inside. He thought about 11 years of showing up and doing the work and caring about a place because it deserved to be cared about and never quite being able to own any of the future of it. "Good," he said. "He should." Lily looked at him. "How's the East Side project?" "Moving, slowly. The way it should have been moving from the beginning." He paused. "Nakamura is a careful partner. Asks better questions than I did." "Is that difficult, sharing the decision-making?" He thought about it honestly, which was something he'd been doing more of. "Less than I thought it would be," he said. "It turns out that having someone ask better questions than you improves the outcome." "Radical concept," she said, and there was something in the way she said it, dry, very slightly warm around the edges. That was close to a joke, or as close as Lily Harper got to a joke, which was apparently within reach. "I know," he said. "I'm working on it." She looked at him for a moment. "The bank's compliance officer is going to be in contact with your team in January to set up the reporting schedule. Don't make her life difficult. Her name is Patricia, and she is extremely thorough." "I will be fully cooperative with Patricia," he said. "I'll believe it when I see it." "That's fair," he said. They stood for a moment on the sidewalk with the December night around them and the restaurant lit behind them and the city moving past in its constant way, and there was a quality to the silence that was different from the silences they'd had before. Less weight to it, less unresolved material. Not resolved exactly. Not wrapped up with a conclusion. Just people who had been through something, standing at the end of the hard part of it. Not entirely sure what came next, but reasonably confident it wasn't worse. "I want to say something," Ethan said. "You keep saying that and then saying something." "I know. I'm going to keep doing it." He paused. "What you built in there tonight, the cooperative, the foundation, all of it. What you did for Danny and for these people, that's not something most people would do. It would have been easy to just hold the asset, sell it later, use it for something practical. You didn't." She looked at her coat buttons. "It was the right thing," she said. "That's all." "I know. I'm saying it anyway." She was quiet. "My son asked me about you," he said. She looked up. "He asked who the woman was that started everything. I told him you were someone who worked at a restaurant and stood up for somebody when she didn't have to." He paused. He said, "Is she nice?" I said, "I think she is, mostly." He said, "Is she your friend?" And I said, He stopped. I didn't know what to say to that. Lily looked at him for a moment, something in her expression that was careful and also, underneath the careful, genuinely present. "What did you end up saying?" she said. "I said I thought we were something. I wasn't sure exactly what." She considered this. "That's an honest answer." He said it was a weird answer. "He's right," she said. "It is weird." She paused. "Tell him something. Working on it. Something like that." "Something," Ethan said. "Something," she agreed. She pulled her coat closer and looked down the street, and the city moved past them and the wind had a real edge to it now, and the restaurant behind them was warm and full of people who owned something for the first time. And somewhere uptown an 8-year-old was probably still awake past his bedtime, playing something on a screen in a bedroom with a window that looked onto a street where more things happened than in a garden. "I should go," Lily said. "Yeah." She started walking. She'd gone about half a block when she stopped and turned back. "Ethan," she said. He looked up. "December 14th, she said. "The school thing. Did you go?" He looked at her. "Third row?" he said. "The whole time." She stood there for a moment on the sidewalk in her dark coat with the city behind her and the winter light making everything flat and clear, and she nodded once. It was a small nod, but it carried something in it. Not approval exactly, more like recognition, like the acknowledgement of a thing that mattered. Then she turned and walked, and the city absorbed her the way it absorbed everyone, and Ethan stood on the sidewalk in front of Belarus restaurant for a moment alone. He thought about what Nakamura had said on the phone, how a person behaves when they are losing. He thought about Noah on the stairs in his pajamas. He thought about Sarah's birthday card in the box in the back of the new closet, in the apartment that smelled like other people and would eventually smell like them. He thought about what it had cost to lose what he'd lost, and what it had clarified, and whether those two things balanced. They didn't balance. Loss didn't work on a ledger. You didn't gain insight in exchange for what went, as if the universe were keeping fair books. You just lost things, and if you were paying attention, if you had stopped moving long enough to actually see what was happening, you understood things you hadn't understood before, and you carried both, the loss and the understanding, not as trade-offs, but as the same weight. He was 32 years old. He had a smaller company and a smaller apartment and a signed restructuring agreement and a compliance officer named Patricia who was extremely thorough. He had a project he was building with a partner who asked better questions than he did, and a kid who had his mother's eyes and knew that avoiding things was avoidance, and a box in a closet he opened now instead of leaving on the shelf. He had the version of himself that stood in a coffee shop on Amsterdam Avenue and said, "I'm sorry" to someone's face without checking first whether it would get him something. It wasn't everything. It wasn't what he'd had. But it was real, and it was his, and he had earned it through the specific hard work of becoming slightly less of the person he'd been. He put his hands in his pockets and turned up the street and walked north through the December city, past the lights and the windows, and the ordinary life of people moving through their evenings in all their particular directions. And the cold air was clean in his lungs, and he was neither running nor stopping, but just moving at the pace of someone who had somewhere to be, and wasn't afraid of the distance between here and there. 4 blocks up, he passed the coffee place on Amsterdam Avenue, small, slightly cramped. The handwritten menu on the chalkboard still up even this late. The repaired espresso machine visible through the window. A man behind the counter doing the end-of-day cleaning. Ethan stopped. He looked at it for a moment. Then he pushed the door open and went in, and ordered a coffee he probably didn't need, and sat at a table by himself for a while in the ordinary light of a place that didn't know or care who he was, and drank it slowly and didn't rush, and let the evening be exactly what it was. Outside, Manhattan went on without him for a while. It was very good at that. It would still be going when he finished his coffee and walked the rest of the way home. And it would be going tomorrow and the day after, building and tearing down and building again in its relentless accumulating way. He had added to it. He would add to it again. But tonight he sat in a chair and drank his coffee and listened to the city instead of trying to outrun it. And that was enough. It was, he was learning, almost always enough.